Perfect. We'll start with me, and this is actually driven around your great performance last time, Councillor Booth, that you asked all the questions, so we only ever saw you. But look, me and Nigel, and for those that are listening, we just wanted to share with you who's in the room. I'll pass now to Councillor Pye.
Good morning. Councillor Michelle Pye, thank you.
Good morning, Councillor Scott Shannon.
Good morning, Councillor Gavin Oliver.
Good morning, Councillor Stacey Scott.
Tēnā koutou, Councillor Owen Jackson.
And Councillor Alan Booth.
And kia ora, I am Vinci Belante, the long-term plan project lead.
And Jason Rivet, Financial Advisor, giving some financial advice to the long-term plan preparation.
Okay, this morning's workshop, councillors, is on the financial strategy and the infrastructure strategy at a very high level. You have been sent the information from Taituara on the dollars and cents manual, and there were just a couple of pages of that that are particularly relevant for today's presentation, and that was around the Local Government Act regulations and sections that pertain to what both of these documents must contain. And so today is the opportunity. We're going to go through and highlight some of these features and these facts, and it's the opportunity for you to ask questions. We will touch on a high level the current financial situation of the council, some of the issues that will be facing us for this LTP. It is no secret that this LTP will be the hardest LTP in local government history because of the government reforms, the uncertainty of the timing, the likelihood that there will be changes post-election, and plus also this council has a very strong drive for delivery for a lot of our infrastructure projects and the implications that that will have. But this LTP is really the LTP of delivery. And it's up to you. You will give us the direction on how you want that to look. So today's session is about giving you that high level for you to engage in open conversation so we can actually get some kind of indication of the various options we will present to you through this process for you to make the best decisions for your community. So without further ado, I will go ahead and start the presentation. Fantastic. Yes, that's us too. Okay. I haven't made avatars of all of you, but I have of some of you. And isn't it interesting the way people see you? Okay. So Jason will start.
Thank you, Vinci. Look, this is a session that I've been waiting for a long time to have a discussion around the financial strategy. And this is a really important document along with the infrastructure strategy that they link together, they line up together, and this is really Councillor's first chance to have a discussion around what strategy you would like to see for the next long-term plan. And really it's around a guide for council and a guide for staff in terms of how we go about, I guess, running the organisation from a financial sense. And in terms of talking cents, in terms of dollars and cents, it's very clearly around prudence. And so the dollars and cents manual that Vince had sent out is really key in terms of just understanding some of those concepts. So really the financial strategy takes our vision, it identifies some of our long-term infrastructure challenges and our drivers, and aligns with the community in terms of understanding how we manage and certainly how we understand the financial consequences of our steps that we take. And the financial strategy covers many things. It covers our rates, it covers our debt levels, it covers how much debt headroom, it covers how we want to fund things, it covers our capital, and this is really the chance to get out of councillors what it is you want to see going forward within the parameters and the financial challenges that we face, and we can have a discussion around some of those as well. And really the last bullet point is just this, that holistic and aligned financial and service reality to our vision. So it's really putting your vision into practice. Vince had sent out a presentation, I think James was the avatar who presented that one, around some of the key things around the legislative requirements for a financial strategy. One of the first ones is really around Section 100, having a balanced budget. Very simply, making sure that our operating revenues and our expenditure link in and tie, that we're really not capitalising operating costs going forward, so that we're living within our means from a financial sense. Section 101 talks about the prudent financial management, and I've sort of covered some of that around prudence and just making sure that we consider that in everything that we do. And Section 101A, financial strategy, this is where the key is. It's a guide, so that we use when we consider making decisions and how we fund things and just the whole business of council, put simply.
Right, and of course, there's also the legislative drivers for the infrastructure strategy. The big difference being the infrastructure strategy has to have the projected projects, build, and budget for 30 years, whereas your financial strategy is only for 10 years with the LTP. For the obvious reasons, it's because when we're dealing with infrastructure, we're talking about a longer life of the assets, and you need to adequately plan for those 30 years into the future, okay? We also have a number of policies and some statements, some financial statements that must be included with your LTP. We must adopt them along with the LTP, and often, for instance, with the revenue and financing policy, you must adopt it prior to the LTP. It's usually done in the same meeting because that is how you set your rates for your long-term plan. We also have a number of policies that can be adopted before the LTP, and that will be at meetings prior. And an example of that will be your significance and engagement policy. So those things will come to you in due course, and our workshop on October the 10th is when we introduce some of those policies. And we will have Bronwyn Larkins, our senior policy advisor, present at this workshop to go over those policies for you. Okay. There are some key considerations, and it always comes down to how you balance affordability to your levels of service. That's the key issue. And how are you going to fund those services, your programs, and your projects? As said before, both the financial and infrastructure strategies must be hand in glove. So Jason and I have to work very closely together. I'll be working with the infrastructure team. I have been liaising with a few of them already, so I can identify some of the key issues coming up, which I will highlight here at the high level. But we will be working very closely together because it's so important these two documents tell the same story. Different aspects of the story, but the same story. You have to answer the question and ask yourselves, what is deliverable and affordable? And that's a question that we will pose to you because you decide that for your communities that you represent. One of the key things is, are we going to lower, maintain, or raise levels of service? All of those have financial implications, which we will explain. Are we looking at new assets for the community? You have a very high Ford work program with some key assets that you're committed to. So you need to actually consider the timing of those. Have we got it right on the current schedule? Do you want to bring something forward? Do you want to defer something? Are you going to add new to the mix? Everything comes with a financial caveat attached to it. And how do we balance that financial resilience that you must have with rates affordability? By and large, the mayor has indicated that, of course, the community is comfortable paying rates when they can see what they get for them. Would you agree, Your Worship? Yeah. And it's about transparency and accountability and ensuring whatever rates are set, we're very clear in our messaging what that means for our community. And how much do we rely upon and use any investment income that this council may have? And Jason is the resident expert to talk about that further. So we have some tensions, of course. You have key objectives. You have to fund the delivery of facilities of services. You have to fund optimized capital renewals programs. You have to appropriately fund your service growth. And remember, growth in this district is economic growth. And we need to do more to boost economic growth to generate that population growth that we're seeking. You also have to maintain prudent debt-to-income ratios and your safe level of debt headroom. We will be explaining that later on in this presentation. And you have to maintain and acknowledge acceptable rates increases in order to deliver some of the key objectives and the infrastructure projects. Rates will go up and borrowing is probably inevitable, but the choices are completely up to you, and we will take our direction from what you decide you want. So the mayor's voice here. Your role as a council is to help set this strategic direction and monitor the delivery. You need to abide by certain principles in setting these strategies. We need to be talking about fairness and equity to current and future generations. And what we mean by that, and a key example, is we're not talking equality because that assumes everybody's at the same level to begin with, but with equity, we recognize that there will be people in different sectors or levels on the socioeconomic scale, and so some of our rates are going to have larger impacts on some groups, particularly marginalized groups. And an example is if you have your UAGC, or your Uniform Annual General Charge, the higher that is, the more it impacts lower income people, because it's a set fee regardless of property values. So that's something to keep in mind as we go through when you're actually determining the levels you want your UAGC to be at, as opposed to your rates based on property values. It's important that you abide by the principle that current ratepayers need to pay for the services available to them currently, including those infrastructure assets that they are using, okay? So we can't defer artificially. It's not prudent to do so that future users are paying for current users. You're not subsidizing the next generation, or this next generation is not to subsidize the current generation. That's what that prudent financial accountability is meaning. But it is important that the future ratepayers do contribute to their fair share for the benefits that they get, which is why for big infrastructure projects, you debt fund that, and you have what we call intergenerational equity, which means that the future generations are paying for the use of those services as well because they get a benefit. So that again brings us down to the principles of fairness. Everybody pays their fair share. That's what the principles in the LGA are saying. Okay.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about financials, both in terms of this slide and the next one, and then there's a few more around our debt levels and our current debt and our debt headroom. But this is just a quick slide from the 23-24 annual plan, just really to reinforce on the left-hand side is where does our money go? This is from an operational perspective only, and where does our money come from? And so really rates is 55% of our total revenue. Certainly subsidies and grants at 22% and fees and charges at 18%. And on the left-hand side, you can see that from an operational sense, roading there at 24%, and I think Three Waters, when you add them together, around 23-24% as well. So large infrastructure basis, recreation and leisure at 19% of spend as well, which is our pools and libraries and a lot of those areas as well. So I'll go into some of that in more detail later on. And this is our capital works program for 23-24, 81.7 million budget. Big spend on Three Waters, pretty much the same spend on roading and footpaths, and recreation and leisure, of course, with some of the, I guess, the Egantai and the Theatre Roll spend as well in that space. So it's a really ambitious capital program. One of our challenges going forward is we need to be very aware of how large a capital program that we do choose to have from a renewals perspective and then from a new asset perspective as well. Because obviously, given our income streams, high capital potentially leads to some high debt and some high borrowings as well. So as part of this financial strategy, I really want to get a sense from councillors where they see the size of the capital program, where they see the size of rates, numbers, and those sorts of things as well.
One thing to keep in mind, even though we're saying that there's quite high spend here, your level of service and your delivery in infrastructure capital has increased over the years. So you are delivering more. Whereas previously you used to deliver about 30 million a year, you're now, in this past year, it was around 55 million. You've reached as high as 70 million in the past 3 years. So this really is a period of delivery to the community of key infrastructure projects that are needed. So you are helping to set up the scene for future generations to have really good, robust infrastructure. And that does come at a cost. It's a short-term pain for very long-term gains.
And I think it's really key over the last long-term plan. We've sort of spent $185 million in capital work over those 3 years, and before that it really was at that 30 million. And that has seen our debt increase, but it's certainly delivered services both in terms of maintenance and new assets that the community has sought. And this LTP needs to continue with delivery, but also really focus on that affordability as well.
This is a council in casual observation as a layperson that really punches above its weight for its delivery, which is to be commended. And it is something that will be recognized in the annual report forthcoming. Okay, do you have any questions about that information? I'll take that as everybody's okay with that. Jess, could you exit, please? Sorry, we'll just go back to our normally scheduled presentation in just a moment. Okay.
All right, for the next wee while, I'm going to talk about some of our current financial parameters, and I want to talk about our current financial state, some of our funding sources, which Lindsay's going a bit fast on, and our current debt levels, our current debt, and our debt headroom. So in terms of, let's just go back to that one. So just as a reminder, net assets, $1.7 odd million. A big chunk of that, about 700 million of that is Three Waters. revenue. Okay. And just a reminder that our total revenue is about 128 million, our operating expenditure is 122. Our capital program, as was highlighted on the previous presentation, 81.7, of which we're looking at about new borrowing of 43 million in terms of that. So I think that's fine, we can move on. And if we go to the current funding sources.
Okay.
Just like that, I think Vincy, the timing doesn't seem to be patient in and out.
We have problems with this setup in here. Jess?
It's fine, just go down and we can just...
I can't
Oh, you can't
operate
move,
with this. We really need a keyboard here. Sorry.
So these are some of the things I do want to cover off in terms of really, we have to have a good discussion around debt. We all need to understand where we are, what our parameters are, what our headroom is, what we want to see going forward. In terms of our funding sources, as I mentioned before, 55% of our funding comes from rates. Rates makes up about $70 million of our total revenue, along with $58 million of non-rates. It's a bit higher in terms of the 23-24 annual plan because we are getting a lot more through subsidies and grants, which we sort of call unguaranteed because we're getting it for 23-24, but we don't quite know what's going to go forward. And so we need to be very careful with our expenditure that we don't overcommit on the basis that we're getting some fees and some subsidies and grants. I also want to talk about some of our reserve funds that we've got, just so that we understand what the restricted reserves are and what the designated reserves are, because they are funding that we do have. And part of one of our funding sources is also loans. So in terms of restricted reserves, these, I think, how much do we have? We've got 18.7 million in restricted reserves. These are really subject to really specific conditions which council cannot revise. So these are bequests from individuals to, say, museum or art gallery, but it also includes our targeted rates reserves for our works and services areas too, which we spend, and we spend in those areas, but of course we've got to spend in those areas. So there's about 18.7 million sitting in those areas. We then have about 25 million in designated reserves. And this is maintained for funding activities which we do determine. So this is where some of our depreciation funds sit. It's where some of the Three Waters reserves sit. It's where our contingency money and our disaster reserve sits as well. So they're not cash funds, but we can use them as internal sources of fund to reduce external debt. So I think it's really important that we do understand that we can use some of that funding as well. So if we move on to loans, so the loans are governed by a financial strategy and our liability management policy. And as Vincy was talking before, in terms of intergenerational equity, loans provide that mechanism to fund long-term assets over a long term. We generally repay loans over 25 to 30 years, but in some cases the assets are depreciated over a longer period, whether it be 50 to 80 years. And the council participates in the LGFA, the local government funding agency, to minimise our borrowing costs. Sorry, I should have mentioned at the start, I'm happy to take questions on the way through rather than wait till the end if we want to talk about any of that stuff that I've just sort of covered off.
Jace, we might just pause for a moment. Councillor Piddington's with us, so I'll just get him to introduce himself, just because he was late this morning.
Hi, Stu Piddington, second term councillor. Cheers.
Just, Jason, you talked about the example. Do you have an example of when we've depreciated over a 50 to 80 years? Because obviously that's Councillor Booth's big beef about the theatre.
Yes,
So,
so we have a few.
Some examples.
Yeah, we have a few examples. So if you look at the Caroline Bay, so Caroline Bay, when it was built, it's not going to last 80 years. And so I'm not even going to guess how long it was depreciated, but let's say it's got a lifetime of, I don't know, 20 years.
What's that?
Caroline Bay, the sea bay. And so it may have a lifetime of whatever it is. And so we borrow the money and we will depreciate over that time period and repay the debt. Something like the theatre, which is modelled at 80 years in terms of the life of that asset, we will borrow the funding, we'll pay it off over 25 to 30 years because it's just, we don't borrow for specific projects, we borrow for the program of work, but the theatre will be depreciated over 80 years and therefore the ratepayers of Timaru will pay it off over 80 years. Is the plan. And there's other assets, so some of Andrew's infrastructure work might last 100 years, some will be 20 years, some will be 30 years.
Yeah, Andrew, do you want to come up and explain, because roads and our water networks are effectively financed and the asset renewal of them out over an extended period of time. Bridges are the same, but Andrew, do you want to explain that?
But also going back to our papers, was it last week, the schedules as far as depreciation rates were sitting in there based on asset classes on what would be normal. So I think property and property improvements was between 1% and 10%. Obviously, this is at the lower end because it's a brand new build within the museum side of things, and so that would be normal within a parameter, wouldn't it?
Do you want to explain the depreciation, roads and bridges and water networks, how they...
Yeah, so with the infrastructure assets, we do depreciate them over a long period of time, but in some cases, so roads, for instance, the actual base course layer of a road is depreciated over about 100 years. And then as you get further up the layers, which was where more wear and tear, it gets less and less. So I think, you basically the top surface layer, your seal is depreciated over 20 years. So they do vary in that respect. Likewise, pipes generally are depreciated depending on the material, like a plastic pipe, polyethylene, or a PVC is depreciated over 100 years, whereas an AC pipe, for instance, which we know has a shorter lifespan, is depreciated only over 70 years. So they are very. Pump station, mechanical plant, generally 25, 30 years. So there's different depreciation rates and depending on their life. It's all linked to that. Of course, depreciation is also linked to the actual replacement cost, so that does change every time we revalue the asset.
Andrew, it's an interesting point around road depreciation, because effectively under our model we have to depreciate that asset, but Waka Kotahi aren't depreciating and allowing for any funding in that regard, are they? So operating under two different models.
Yeah, with roads, yes, we do get the Waka Kotahi, I guess, financial assistance for roads. So yeah, we only are depreciating our local share of those roads. Yeah.
Yeah, and my comparison would be to a state highway as an example. They won't be depreciating; they're just funding replacement effectively, aren't they? In R&M.
I believe that's the case. So yeah, I don't think that they apply depreciation at all because it's cash funded effectively. Yeah.
And I think the reason that depreciation is so key is it's how that's the life of the asset and that's how we fund it. And so if you have the theatre over 80 years versus 30 years, it really makes a significant difference, because if you're going to repay it back over a short period of time, your ratepayers will pay a heck of a lot more. So it's about trying to find that equity and fairness that sort of Vinci has talked about to ensure that the life of the asset is reasonable, and so that each year we put 1/80th or 1/50th of it aside from the current generation. And so that's how the sort of intergenerational thing works, is that people pay today, the people that come in the future in terms of growth then carry on sort of contributing to that as well. So the depreciation rates, they're boring, but they're really, really key.
Depreciation is for the renewal of the asset. That's what the principle behind it is. Of course, in reality, you never actually probably get enough over those years to actually fully fund a renewal of that asset, because rates continue to go up. Your amount of your funding, depreciation that you're funding in the early years is probably not going to be equivalent to the later years. But, yeah.
I wouldn't have thought depreciation rates weren't exciting, Jason.
No, they're not.
Can we, Councillor Parker's joined us. Could you just introduce yourself for those on live stream?
Good morning, and I apologise for being late. I'm Councillor Parker. I am a third chair councillor, and I'm chair of infrastructure.
Actually, if I could make, I guess, one point. If we think about the 23-24 long-term plan, so we started off with rates at around 20% and we got down to 11.1. It's worth remembering that the way we did that was to borrow for the depreciation for that, the additional time. So one of the key things in this financial strategy that I would like to really explore is how we treat depreciation. Lots of councils rate for renewals and replacements, and they just do that only, whereas they don't rate for the new levels of service and the new buildings and some of those things. So I think it's a key funding decision that around the table we really need to explore and flesh out more, because at the moment we arguably rate fully for depreciation, where not every council fully does it. So I think there's some discussions that we can have around some of that, because remembering we only got to 11.1% because we funded depreciation through a little bit of capital.
According to the IRD, around depreciate, useful life of a building is 50 years maximum. So therefore not anything past that. I went to an infrastructure a symposium up in the local government conference just recently and seen an example of civic facilities being built, and they were actually working on 30 years maximum. So 80 years seems and it wasn't that long ago we spent a lot of money on that theatre. Okay, so that was only about, maybe 30 years. That's significant. So, really 30 years is, and perhaps 50 is max on a new build. So I cannot see how you can justify 80 years.
And we can do some modelling. So part of, some of the boring stuff behind the scenes, so we've got a financial system, Magic, which we're using, which enables us to do some real life modelling. So we'll be able to model the theatre over 30, 50, 80 and see what the impacts are. And we can have the discussion around whether 80 is the right useful life from our depreciation, from our accounting policies and our depreciation rates. It sort of fits within it. But I take your point around the IRD rates, which is slightly different.
And do these numbers take into consideration the operational costs of that asset or the liability to the council, to the ratepayer for the life of that asset?
The operating budgets include the op model, the operating costs, whereas the capital budgets do not. No, because it's an operating cost.
Jason, just when we made that decision, we aren't actually doing full depreciation because we didn't have the money to do that, and we picked a number. But
For the annual plan.
For the annual
yes,
plan,
we did.
yep.
Yep.
But I mean, that in theory is going to say, what happens to the shortfall?
Well, we're actually spending, and so as Andrew will say, because the depreciation is to fund renewals and replacements. So we've still got our roading renewals, we've still got our Three Waters costs which are going. So we're still spending it. We just budgeted it out of debt for that annual plan, so that as part of this long-term plan we could address it going forward. Because it's not a sustainable option at all.
Just, I'd like to point out that, our assets are getting towards the end of their useful life. It was the growth of Timaru District was probably around the 1940s, 50s, and that's where a lot of infrastructure was installed. That hence is now getting towards the end of its useful life. So the amount we're having to spend on renewals is quite significant, and it's probably matching the depreciation, if not slightly greater.
So just on that point, Andrew, what have we got coming that we don't know about? Does that include bridges at the end of their useful life? I mean, to me, we kind of sit here and we hear these things but don't see any numbers, and then we're kind of shocked when they land.
I see. Yeah. Bridges is probably one of the key ones that is in front of us. There's a massive hump up there. Bridges are extremely expensive to replace, and we've been focusing a lot of the smaller, short length span ones, but we've got some really large ones coming up, and potentially $10-20 million for a bridge replacement.
And so, and I mean, that's been highlighted, across Canterbury with our submission, didn't it, Councillor Parker, in regard to some of those, Canterbury assets, if you look at Rangitata or Kaya, those sort of assets need to be replaced as well. There's a lot of things in the similar age bracket effectively. There's bridges and there's pipes and there's all those things. I think one of the and some of that will come out through the asset management planning side of it. So we've obviously, as elected members, we're pretty keen to deep dive into that and understand what's in there. The other thing that I just want to challenge everyone on is, yes, we're going to have some of these challenges around the level of capital spend needed over the next 10 or 20 years, but let's also challenge our thinking on how we deliver it, because we've done the same model for a long, long time. So just think about, is there any other alternative ways we can achieve any of what we deliver? At the moment we just go straight to the market and contract out water renewals, as an example. Is there a hybrid model? Should council actually have a team that's, and you might not like hearing this, but I'm pretty keen to challenge everyone's thinking, is should council have a team that is focusing on small main renewals, as an example, that's in-house versus external? I just want to challenge everyone's thinking on how we deliver this and make and have a look at some comparisons versus other councils as well.
I thought you were going to sell our bridges to China, Nigel. We were going to challenge our thinking.
Well,
Just one other thing is everything's all about prudence, and obviously we are here and now, and interest rates have tripled. So we were talking about 2%, and now we're 6%, and so everything we're doing here has to be reflected at 6%. Is that what you've done?
We use bill rates, and that's part of the long-term plan which we're creating. So we have just received the bill rates, which we will use. I can't tell you off the top of my head what they are, but you're dead right. And so, as the Mayor was talking to, we can't approach this long-term plan because there's been a lot of changes. Interest rates, they have then driven our construction costs, so 20% for parks, 20% for a lot of areas that we faced during the annual plan. So those numbers, even though they're baked into the annual plan, we're still under incredible cost pressures. So the times have changed, and that's why the 30-year infrastructure strategy is so key. The activity management plans, so councillors will see each activity management plan for every part of the business. You'll get to see their levels of service, you'll get to see their proposed operating spend, you'll get to see their capital spend, and it's that point, because we can't keep doing what we're doing. We'll have double-digit rates if we just keep going. So something needs to change. It's whether it's levels of service up or down, it's whether we look at depreciation differently, it's whether we look at our current BAU costs and really challenge whether we need to make savings. It's the size of our capital program. So you'll see each activity management plan, and it's at that point, because then if they're approved, we go away and cost it. And we need at that point for them to be challenged, for them to be critiqued, because that'll form the basis of what we do going forward. And Vince will talk a little bit about activity management plans at the end of this presentation.
Yeah. Sorry, just carrying on from that, but probably Andrew, in regards to your, obviously the infrastructure is the big, the capital spend on infrastructure. Is that backed? If that, you say a pipe needs replaced because it's 50 years old, but actually, is that based on fact, as in it's fallen to pieces, or have you actually done a thorough infrastructure inspection of in recognising what's actually failing? Because those pipes in the ground may still be perfectly fine for another 50 years. So is it based on, oh, that's old and we need to replace it, or is it actually based on the fact that actually it's decaying and it's starting to fall to bits? Because that makes a hell of a difference.
Yeah, we do a lot of modelling behind the scenes in regard, particularly with pipes. So we have regular inspections of sewer lines. We're using CCTV through the lines and having a look at the condition of them. With water mains, it's a little bit more difficult. You can't look inside them. But every time we do a connection or repair, we actually take a sample of the pipe and get that tested to see what the wall thickness is. So it is very much, our renewal program is based on the condition of the pipe, the type of material the pipe is. We know that AC fails a lot earlier than you know, cast irons and those pipes, yeah. We know that concrete water mains, which we're replacing in Pleasant Point at the moment, you know, that they do leak around the joints. So it's based on industry standards, our own testing and condition assessments. So we develop a model. You're quite correct. We have pipelines out there that are over 100 years old that are still perfectly okay.
Sorry, Andrew, on that point with the water mains, Hadley and Brunton have like a drone pick or something that they put through the water pipe, don't they? To check joints, so they do have.
What was that?
Hadley and Brunton's have they put something through water mains to check joints, etc. Are you aware of that?
Yeah, it is still difficult getting into those water mains because they're under pressure. And so if you shut down a water main, you can access through a hydrant and put cameras down through there. Yeah, we have done that. There is, you've got to be careful too with public health and that the equipment that goes down there has to be fully sterilised.
No, I get that. But if you're, I guess, it's a cost benefit. If you were weighing that up, if you had a 10-kilometre pipeline that you thought that was end of life, it would probably make sense in spending the $10,000 to understand whether it's got another 20 years of life or you're going to rip it up and spend a couple of mil to replace it. It's probably,
Yeah, one of the main reasons around water supply is we look at failures as well and how many failures we get on a particular section of line, and unfortunately, water mains, it is hard to predict them and you can sweat the assets and push the risks a bit more, but then community would have to accept a greater number of failures, greater number of water outages.
the Wellington model.
Wellington model, exactly. That's probably a classic example of sweating the asset.
Just going back to fiscal prudence, page in the Tuatara document, 3.1. It talks about balanced budget benchmark in regards to revenue, and that excludes income and development contributions, financial contributions, revaluation gains or on derivative financial instruments, invested assets. And then there's also, so we're operating in an unbalanced budget, aren't we?
We have balanced budgets.
Yeah. And
Sorry, we have a balanced budget. Year 2 of the long-term plan, there was the district plan was going to be funded, which is an operating cost through debt, and that threw out an unbalanced budget that year. It's not at the end of the world having an unbalanced budget, but at this stage we do have a balanced budget. The things that you were talking about just then is really good because there's certain types of revenue which you can't count as revenue. Sometimes around vested assets, which they're non-cash, so of course you can't carry them through. And so that's what we've got to be very careful with some of that unguaranteed revenue, which is revenue, but it's not revenue that we can count for our balanced budget or we can count for our debt to revenue ratio. So there are some differences which you're pointing out then. But we do have a balanced budget.
also mentions around debt servicing benchmarks and not to exceed 10% of rates.
Yeah, my next slide.
Sorry, I just want to go back to depreciation. I didn't get a chance to ask it again. I'm interested in not so much the rate you land on, but the process on how you get to that rate. So the policy is, 1% to 30%. How do you, what kind of information or how do you calibrate what you, what you land on, and do you compare it to what other councils use?
Generally, I think what Andrew answered before was fantastic in terms of how they assess the condition of their assets and the like. And so he's got industry benchmarks, he's got other councils. So I think in the infrastructure space, I would say that it's really clear in terms of our depreciation rates. I think where it gets a bit not looser is around some of the above assets, the vertical. And so if we use the theatre as an example, and so what I'm hearing is that through the IRD rates and some of the other things, other councils do put them out because in a way it's easier over a longer term, but it's still got to match the life of the asset. And so the advice that we got at that point around the theatre was that clearly it's an 80-year asset, so we chose to put it out over that. Sea Bay, 20-year asset, because of course chlorine, corrosive, all that sort of stuff. Some of their kit will break down earlier or need replacement earlier. The building might last this long, so it really is an analysis around each asset type.
I think here too, you get a degree of assurance around the process from what audit do with our LTP and then our annual report. So when we do our LTP, audit get hold of our infrastructure strategy and our asset and activity management plans, particularly around the big areas where the money really is at stake, like the three waters and the roading, and they are assessed essentially by a group of by a team to ensure that in Audit New Zealand, and they may even bring in outside expertise to support them in that. They do. And what that does is that's looked at across the country. So they get, they look at our asset data and give it quite a scrutiny, and then that's assessed in terms of not just what we're providing, but it is measured against others. When they come to audit the annual report, they then look at what, and this is the vexed question that we often go on about revaluations and so on. They look at the value of the network, but they also look closely at the depreciation and the condition of that network and how we're assessing it. So these issues about the fact that audit are saying that there is a reasonable basis for reliance on what we're putting into our documents become really, really important, because it is underlying that is the quality of the information that goes into the asset assessments and the conditions that inform our activity management plans, our asset management plans, and our infrastructure strategies. And they get quite a scrutiny from audit, and they get it from people who are well versed in activity and asset management, particularly around infrastructure. So it's not it's not, to go back to your point, Councillor Booth, it's not like an IRD where they say, here's a car, or here's a motorbike, here's a forklift, here's the rate of depreciation. There's a really strong process around how they determine what is the condition of the asset, and that comes including from the quality of the data, and that's then measured and scrutinised and tested by an independent group of people. So it is, I think, what you can, and if you look into our infrastructure strategy, you'll see that our water and wastewater networks are in reasonable condition overall, and they're not. If you look at it, we colour code the expected life of those assets, and there's quite a bit of life left in a number of those assets. So that's been subject to a lot of challenge and scrutiny.
Yeah, I guess there are some issues coming up, particularly in the roading side of things. One I will point out is we're only replacing about 5 kilometres a year of roads and renewals. You work that out over a 1700k network. Effectively, you're asking your roads to last about 200 to 150 years. It's just not going to happen. So, but we're still managing that through additional maintenance and extending lives, etc. that way. So, but potentially in the future, that's going to be a bit of a hump, I guess, another hump that's coming up. It could be 10 years away, it could be 30 years away. We don't know at this stage.
That won't be uncommon with local authorities, though, across the country. It's actually a
we're not
national
alone.
issue. No,
It's a major issue.
It's a major issue.
So it
Because
actually comes down to it's a local government problem, but it's also a central government.
It's a
very
national.
much so.
Yeah, it's a
Well, it's
national
a funding problem, isn't it?
Yes.
Who holds 92% of the funding? We can find them a solution.
Yeah.
This is a national problem in terms of the roading and the bridge network, because a lot of it, again, happened post-World War II, and of course the vehicles since then have become much heavier and a lot more frequent. So if you think about the roads that went in the 50s, 60s and 70s, they weren't, I don't think, anticipated to have the use and put on them that they have now.
No, far from, yeah. And you're basically looking at one truck is equivalent to 10,000 cars when it comes to actual damage to the road. Yeah, and the number of trucks that are on our roads these days compared to what they were back in the 60s, it's a phenomenal increase. So.
And if actually government recognised the economic activity in our funding model, then actually we'd probably be able to work towards a solution a lot quicker ourselves, wouldn't we?
Fully support you.
Fully support, yeah.
Yeah, and interesting, we'll flick that around, actually, the draft submission to the GPS on, what is it, land transport, isn't it, technically?
The GPS, yeah.
Yeah, highlights the underspend across Canterbury in their last GPS versus, well, and probably proposed. So effectively, Canterbury's had a real underspend in roading and infrastructure associated with roading. Probably goes back to the earthquakes, doesn't it? Effectively, that would be my analysis of it.
You know, I'd probably go off on a little bit of a tangent here, sidetrack, but you know, if you look at the actual income regard from fuel excise duty, road user charges, it's been flatlined for the last probably 6, maybe 9 years, I think it is, because you know vehicles are becoming more efficient. They're not using as much fuel. Although we've got increased travel, the actual use of those fuels is remaining the same. And of course, with electric vehicles coming online, those electric vehicles are actually paying nothing towards the road at the moment because they're not charged any road user charge. There's no fuel excise duties. So.
I believe National have said that they're looking at that in their policy to look to move to kilometres.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
To address that concern.
It needs to happen.
Yeah.
Sorry, just an aside, Andrew, on that roading thing, I think we need to have that discussion so the public's aware. And when we have groups come in here and want 2Ks extended on their road, we actually need to paint the full picture. As you say, with what we're funding at the moment, actually, we've got a couple of humps coming in a big way, and they may be on main arterial routes. So I think it goes back to what the Mayor said. We've got to deep dive in some of this stuff and not fritter it away. If we actually do have some serious spending to do, it should be in the right spot. But I think we all need to be aware of that.
Yeah. And the asset management plans will be the opportunity to do that.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that. That's a good question, Councillor Paddington. And the activity management plan is the time. So this council previously has not seen activity management plans. They haven't been published before. So it's really the contract for each activity, roading. So it's the chance to really, what is our level of service? Can we keep doing 5 kilometres of resealed? What does it look like? Then our community can really ask the questions. Actually, that's not good enough. We want more. And so we can go, right, well, this is what it costs. This is what it looks like. And these are the humps that are coming. So for each activity, you'll have that stuff in detail. You'll be able to dive right down. I wouldn't mind moving on to debt, if that was okay. So just answering Councillor Booth's question from a while ago. So these are our credit limits as set out in our liability management policy. So these are from the LGFA. So net annual interest expense will not exceed 30% of total annual rates income. Net annual interest expense will not exceed 20% of total revenue. And our net debt will not exceed 280%. Note that Council did set the 210% in the last financial strategy, and liquidity will be greater than 110% in terms of our current assets over our current liabilities. So that's what our current liability management policy says. As part of the long-term plan, we can revisit some of those areas, and certainly as part of the financial strategy, we'll have a look at that net debt to revenue ratio as well.
That's different to local government New Zealand.
I'm curious, you just mentioned 10% before. That's what
I'm just reading out of the Tuatara here. That's where it says that.
Yeah, so these were set by LGFA and adopted by Timaru District Council.
It does say borrowing costs are less than 10% of operating revenue as defined in the balanced budget benchmark. So if we're not operating a balanced budget, I guess you can...
we are operating a balanced budget. These were the guidelines that were adopted by Council at the last long-term plan.
For those who are not operating a balanced budget, it's 15% of operating revenue.
Sorry, can you just read that again?
It's on page 3.1. It's on figure 3.1. It's in the wee box there.
It's page 16.
Oh, just two. And that's the benchmarks of fiscal prudence. And previous in our strategy, I noted that we actually have been 10 and 15%. So 10% of rates and 15% of total revenue.
So those are the financial prudence measures that, so in our annual report, we report against those those prudence measures. And so at the moment, of course, we're within the 10%. We just have a policy, and I'm not sure exactly why, but 30%. But we are meeting all those prudence graphs. And if you look at the last page of our annual report, those are where those graphs exist. So if we move on to the next slide, Vince.
Sorry, I mean, I'd just say, Councillor Booth, I'd have thought we were going to be well and truly inside those. I mean,
we are, yeah.
If whether you take it at 10% of rates would mean our borrowing costs, which essentially interest and charges like that, would have to be in the order of 7 million. But if it's operating revenue, then it's in the order of 12 million. And our financing costs are well below that. They're, 4 million or something like that. So we're very comfortably and really comfortably inside those sort of margins, I'd have thought.
Yeah, no, it was just the fact that they were different to what I was looking at in here. And I guess that we need to take appreciation, though, of actually the current interest rates, not actually what we've got locked in. And so whatever that is the number. And if you're going to borrow $200 million at 6%, that's 12 million per year.
Yeah,
so it's getting up there.
Yeah, no, and that's a fair point. And so we'll be using the bill interest rates going forward, which will reflect some of that information. One of the things to be aware of course, is that we've locked in some interest. We've got interest rate hedging and things in place. And for the next few years, we're actually paying our weighted average cost of capital is actually very low. And going forward, it's something we need to be aware of. In terms of debt and borrowings, as at 31 July, I think we've gone the page too far, but as at 31 July, our borrowings were $205 million, with a net debt position at $165 million. And of course, as we all know, the difference between the 205 and the 165 is the cash reserves that we hold. Just while Vince is going to the page. Our debt to revenue ratio as at 31 July 2023 is 131%. We're just catching up now. And what I found interesting from the Miles presentation from Bancorp was that as at 30 June 22, the average debt to revenue ratio for Timaru at that point was 122%, and for all the local authorities across the country was 91%. So we're not totally out of whack with the average of the councils. There are some councils with a significantly higher amount. And of course our current limit is 210, so at the moment we're comfortably within it. And if we move to the next slide. Vinci, if we move on, please. So our net debt is 165. And what I'm trying to do here is talk about our net debt headroom as at the moment. So if we take away all the unguaranteed revenue, the things that we can't guarantee that we're going to receive in the future, and it'd be unwise and not prudent to include, we have debt headroom if we maintain a 210% policy of 59.6. And if we go out to the 2.8 as per LGFA, 134.7 million of debt headroom left. It gets complicated. So on the next slide, I've got two slides, one that I'll talk to and then one that Vinci will talk to around Three Waters. Because Three Waters...
Sorry, Jace, can you go back to that one? Yep. Go back a slide. I guess part of my concern is we do the here and now. I'd like to see that number because on simplistic terms, if we did the theatre at 46 million, 210% in my simple mind is we've got under 10 million left in headroom where we sit now.
Yeah, that's it's not quite as simple as that, but when we spread it out over a period of time, and I guess what I'm trying to show is here and now, this is some of the headroom. And of course, waters complicates it, whether it's in or out of what we're doing. And so if we do move on to the next slide around Three Waters.
Sorry, I want to go back though. What I want to know in the future is when we make big decisions like the theatre, upgrading the art gallery and the stadium, what effect it has on those numbers. Because you say it's not quite correct. So am I 5 million out? Am I 40 million out? Because it doesn't give me a lot of confidence.
Yeah. So in the long-term plan 21-31, the financial strategy includes numerous graphs, one of them which shows the financial strategy. So the former council, 21-31 council, signed off those debt levels which peaked at 282.88 in year 9 or whatever. So that is the time, once you've done all the activity management plans, once you've challenged everything, I'll come back and go, all right, here's what it looks like for the next 10 years. And that'll take into account the theatre decision. We can do some modelling with, for argument's sake, that in and out. We can then play around with things to get it at a limit that councillors are comfortable with.
Yeah, no, I get that, but I also, Councillor Booth's point on interest rates, when we did that 3 years ago, the interest rates were 2.6% on the borrowing. So I guess going forward, what I'd like is something that moves with us, not a snapshot in time every 3 years.
Yeah, no, and that's a good point. You want to be able to see it in real time. Just as you recall what Miles was saying, if you look out because of the hedging, if I can just come back to the additional borrowing shortly, but if you look out on the hedging on your borrowing as forecast in the LTP, your total cost of funds isn't going to move a lot, notwithstanding those interest rates. So there's that part. The reason it's not if you take some of those projects like the stadium and the theatre, quite a lot of the borrowing's already baked into that number. So what we have to then go and model is the marginal amount that we're borrowing for those projects and see how it maps, keeping in mind that some of your other revenues will also be increasing. So to your point, Councillor Piddington, it will be useful for you to see, if you like, a real-time slideshow of the revenue, the borrowings and the headroom. But it's why at the moment that, to Jason's point, that sort of 59.6 isn't quite the full story, if you like, because some of that money, because we'd already modelled that we would be borrowing X dollars for these projects, and that's baked into the models already. So that's why there's a bit more work to be done on that. It's to sort of give you an idea of where the limits are sitting at the moment, but the limits haven't been fully iterated. How that affects the models, we haven't yet worked into it, because we're trying to sort of give it a snapshot.
I think when we do that modelling, Jace, and going back 3 years, we were looking at the interest rates, and those were the bill rates and what were projected, and we know what that's going to look like moving forward. But part of that modelling might be actually what's a risk factor of 2% or something. What does that look? So that's another line of the modelling, and then that would probably everyone's sort of comfortable with that thinking, and then we know worst case scenario, another pandemic, global crisis, or what have you. We've built some risk factor in. Yeah.
And my question too, sorry, just around the modelling, and I haven't analysed our timeframes around this, but will that be before November? Because we've obviously got major decision coming up on the theatre in November, and so what's the timing for us to see all this modelling?
So the timing is, staff yesterday started the process around building the operating and capital budget. So that'll take till the 29th of September in terms of doing that. So at that point, Bede and his leadership team will have the first time where they'll get to see what things look like. The activity management plans will come to council. I think it's planned for 5th of December is the date that we would bring, because we don't want to bring the first draft numbers because they're not going to be fantastic. And so we as an organisation will need to do some work internally. So I think it's 5 December would be when council would get the first look at the discussion. Although through all the activity management plans you would have had the chance to see what each activity was costing. But 5 December will be the time where you really get the chance to do some modelling. And look, to Councillor Paddington's point, we need to provide good quality information that has models, that has scenarios, that has risks built into it so that you can make good informed decisions. That's what we need to be doing. All right, moving on to Three Waters just quickly. So under scenario one, scenario one, so TDC is an entity I, and the proposed go-live date is 1 July 2025. The next slide, please. The Mayor has made the decision to include Three Waters for the LTP for 10 years. And I think that's really important because having waters in or waters out from a organisational perspective is really, really difficult because we've got all these overheads, we've got all these things to do. So at this stage, we'll be including waters in the long-term plan, and we can remove it if we have to because it's easier. And so we can do that after the election. Some of this information was presented to councillors in the last couple of weeks. Of the 205 million debt that we have currently, 100.4 million of it is waters debt, about 49%. So it's really significant. If water was to be excluded and that the transition happens as scheduled, our new debt would drop down from 205 to 105. Our revenue would go from the 125, less the 25 million that we receive through targeted rates and the like at the moment, down to 100. Our cap, if it was 2.8, 280% would be at 279, which would leave debt headroom of 174 million. If it was at the 210%, therefore our debt headroom would be at 104. And then there's, obviously, we don't know what's going to happen with the debt to revenue rate. If it drops to 1.8 or 1.5, it changes things quite significantly. So what this sort of shows, if I even compare it to the previous slide, is that at 210%, we had, and Councillor Paddington noted, 59.6 of debt headroom. If we had waters gone, we would have significantly more headroom. So waters does account for $25 million of revenue, but we do have significant costs in terms of OPEX and capital coming up, which I know Vince is going to be talking to. But I'm just more alluding to the fact that waters blues this in terms of whether it's in or out. It changes our headroom, it changes our debt levels, and it changes the way that we rate as well. If waters was out, we might have lower rates, but the community might wear much higher charges through water charges. So we've got to think about the community rather than just what is best for this council. Financially, arguably it's better if waters were out, but that's not probably the right thing for the community as a whole.
Right. So I'm moving to the next scenario, which...
Sorry, one question on that. Can you fund through a water rate a future project ahead of time? So rather than debt fund, just hypothetically, we're not going to do this with this one, but Claremont, it's going to cost 30 million. Could we have been saving for it under the model?
My understanding in the Rating Act is you cannot rate for a service you're not currently providing.
Right.
So I don't think you can stockpile rates for a future because something could happen, and legally you can only rate for the current services you are providing.
Because you'd be charging the community something
totally.
that doesn't exist.
Yeah, that was my understanding, but it wouldn't actually be the worst model. Yeah.
Councillor Booth?
I was just wondering about our strategy around the Three Waters when we realised that things were potentially going to change, and as they legislatively have indicated they are. Did we ramp up our infrastructure spend in order to take advantage to get the stuff in there and then unload all the debt? Was that not part of we did talk about that, I'm sure.
No, look, really, we proceeded on the basis that, because these projects take a long time to design and build, we don't just do them sort of overnight. And if you look at a lot of the work, such as Downlands and Parry-Ora Pipeline, they were sometime in the design and the consenting in the build and so on. And then we have always had a program of small main renewals and upgrades and so on. So the assumption has always been, if you look into the long-term plan when we did it, that we would assume that water's remained with us, so we continued our investment on much the same trajectory as we always had. And so that's been more or less the major project that has come in recently is the microfiltration plant that has been accelerated that was out some years, and I can't remember, was it year 6 or 7? And that's been pulled back into more or less into a current time frame. So that's really the only major project that has been accelerated in terms of our three waters. But a lot of those projects were already either proposed back in a number of earlier iterations of the long-term plan.
Are we basing our decisions around affordability or actually the need for the infrastructure? So, like, do we actually say, okay, we can probably afford to spend 40 million, but we're actually spending 60 million? I mean, do we do a bit of a, I mean, I'm just concerned that, and I've probably said it several times, that we've gone from 30 billion up to 165 million, very short period of time. And so, and interest rates have gone through the roof. So, we're potentially, on that, if you put that on a graph, that looks horrible.
That was, and you were there at the last financial strategy discussions 3 years ago, that was our decision to go on that projection, to ramp up our debt to do some of those projects that we haven't done. I've still got the speaking slot.
In part, Councillor Booth, you come back to what Miles O'Connor said to us in terms of the costs of this. It was modelled into the long-term plan. We hedged the funding, and there hasn't been a significant movement in the interest in our cost of borrowing. It's a little bit, but not that significant. So that costing was all baked in when we set the long-term plan back in 2021 to go and ensure that those investments and into that infrastructure was made, because it was seen as enabling of economic development, value add and prosperity and so on. And so it was important to keep that infrastructure and keep investing in it. And so those were sort of the discussions that occurred at the last long-term plan, and that informed the decisions that were made.
I'd like to add that in the space of Three Waters with Te Aurama, Te Mata Arawai have come in with new regulations and new standards that must be met. That will come at a cost to every council in the country, which was part of the government's argument as to why they would take it over. And you have elected that you will strive to meet those standards as an example to prove you can do it if given the proper tools and mechanisms. But every project that any council officer comes to you will have the full financial implications and the difference between what you need to do for compliance, and a lot of this water stuff is about compliance, as opposed to what's the nice to have. And sometimes the nice to have is what's going to benefit the community the best in the long run, and that's what you as governors weigh up for every decision that you make. And this LTP will be no different, particularly when we do bring the infrastructure strategy and the financial strategy to you over the next 2 months as it's developed in stages, for you to have those discussions, make those kind of decisions, and give us the direction how you want those to be structured and your policies to set that framework. Has that addressed your concern, Councillor? To be fair, it's a perfect storm that you guys are in these 2 terms of council, the previous term and this term. You've had a lot of that aging infrastructure coming to the end of its life. The projects that have been in development for the past 10 years are now coming to fruition. So you're bearing the cost of a lot of previous decisions, but you're setting up your community for a really good future. So as I said before, there are some short-term pains, but there are really good long-term gains. And there's no getting around, given the rating base you have, that only the lack of really robust government funding for everything you need to do, that you have to borrow. It's just a matter of course. So it's important that you borrow for the right reasons, for the right projects, and that's only for you guys to decide. We can just give you the best of advice and the best evidence, but you make those decisions and we will put them into action. Sir?
I just wonder, like, at the capital, what we delivered in capital expense
Yes,
this year, I think, is it?
55 million.
55 million. What proportion of that came from the depreciation that we collected? So, I mean, I can see capital expenditure versus debt from a previous financial strategy, which shows that it shows the contribution from debt plus the depreciation fund. So, for instance, we spent 50 million. Did 20 million of that come from the depreciation fund, or 10 million going towards that asset, and then the rest, the balance, borrowed?
To be fair, I wouldn't have that information on hand. It would be something that would come through in the annual report, but I can certainly get somebody to, or.
Yeah, look, in broad order, councillor Booth, we spent all of our depreciation.
Okay.
I mean, there might have been some of the funding that might be, but in broad order, we have, because most of our depreciation is collected for water and roading, and our renewal program means that that isn't required. So essentially all of our, and we will be able to go and see if some of it was provision for particular projects, but most of it, in broad order, we spend all of our depreciation, which is why that debate we had at the annual plan, when our depreciation has risen so much because of the increase in the value of our networks, we have to keep increasing that in order to match the renewals program that comes as a result of it. So essentially, it was all spent.
We should know that number, though. We should know if we collected 15 million in depreciation, 10 million of that went towards, and perhaps some of it may have been capitalised into staff expense, which we did that a few times. So, in other words, we spent 50 million, we put 10 million of the money that we did collect for the reason of depreciation, and we borrowed the rest. And so I guess it comes down to, we are rating the people for the depreciation. All that money should be going towards the capital expense. That's the first thing goes in, and then the money borrowed over and above that to fund the requirement.
Yeah, and that happens. I don't have the numbers because we're still doing the annual report for 2023, but essentially if you look at the high level of the financial statements, we spend all of our, if we provided for depreciation in most areas, then we would have spent it in some shape or form on capital work.
I guess if we're not doing that, the next generation are going to be subsidising this year, this group now.
I know I can speak to roading because I've been working very closely with Susie. They have spent absolutely everything and achieved pretty much all their targets in the roading framework. But we're going to come to a tension point, which I'm going to talk about shortly, is the fact that because there isn't an increase in Waka Kotahi funding, we can't maintain the current levels of service, which are particularly high with the current funding. So either you have to put more funding in, or we need to review those levels of service to see where some cost savings can be made. So we're at that point. But So Roding would definitely have spent every bit of depreciation that was rated for in this term of the LTP that we're currently in. Okay. So can I go to scenario 2 if we retain the Three Waters portfolio? Okay. So the full ownership and management of Three Waters would remain with council. You assume the responsibility to invest in the Three Waters CapEx to meet those regulatory standards, which have become more stringent with the new legislation. There was a proposed program, of course, the transition unit in the DIA and the water team here under Ashley Harper, your transition manager. They put forth a big portfolio of information, budgets and everything to go to the DIA, which did indicate there will be a significant investment needed in the next 10 years for some critical works and for some desired works, okay? So there's a range of projects in that portfolio, which if we retain, we will be looking at and scheduling over that 30-year infrastructure strategy what works would be done when, subject to the testing of their viability and end of life. We know with some of those stricter standards that there is some CapEx that will need to be done, and it will be up to you how you fund that, either through rates or through loans. But we will be striving to try and identify what those are prior to you making any decisions, and hopefully prior to the election. Our next workshop is the 10th of October, the election obviously being on the 12th. Should there be any changes, we will come back to you with revised figures, of course. There's a very optimistic view that we'll know by the 14th.
No, the election's the 14th.
Oh, the election's the 14th. Oh, okay, by the 16th. But by the 16th, I think I got told previously we'll have a decision. But I think that will be very optimistic. But by the time we have the workshop in November, we should have some certainty to give you a revised picture, okay, if necessary.
It would be quite nice to have an executive summary of what Ashley's done in regards to
I can certainly
numbers.
work with the water team to provide something for you,
Well,
councillors.
considering we're probably going to end up having to
Absolutely,
look after it,
yeah.
and it's our biggest item.
It is. Now, please keep in mind, when you're proposing something, and every council has done this around the country, when you're proposing something for central government who are going to be funding it, you're putting forth your best foot, and you're putting all your nice-to-haves in there as well. And that's advocating for your community to make sure you get the lion's share, particularly for the investment put in. So, you know, there are some projects in there that are about blue sky thinking, and then there are some that are about compliance. And what you will get will be a summary to try and quantify those various projects.
Yeah, so we've done quite a bit of work in looking at that forward program for the transition unit. Yeah, so there's basically three scenarios. There's a blue sky scenario, which is the wish list. Anything that should be done is done, and that is quite unaffordable, to be honest. Then there is a lower level scenario.
Sorry, and on that, that's the 185 billion that DIA.
Yes,
ended
that's
up
right,
using.
they've used that
So,
figure.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not the Australian TV program.
No. But then there's a I guess a more moderated model, which is what we should be doing, anticipating, and that's the model that we'd probably present to you. And then there's this what we're doing at the moment, current levels of service, effectively. So, you know, the model and the in between model is probably doubling expenditure, is where it's sitting at the moment. Doubling of current expenditure.
So when you say doubling, Andrew, can you give us an amount? Again, you know, we've got things in the background going on.
Yeah.
You must be able to ballpark what the additional amount is.
About 60 million over 10 years.
Extra.
that's total, so when we're running on around, that's for just, that's not including the new stuff, that's just for renewals effectively and maintenance.
Yeah, oh, that's fine.
So we're effectively, I think we're sitting around 3 million a year, so moving to 6 million a year.
That's still a massive rise in rates, isn't it? Another 6%.
Yeah.
So Mike, what's the difference between now, today, and 3 years ago with the recommendation from the water team around increase in spend in that space? Because actually I wouldn't have thought that would have changed a whole lot outside of, you know, the water reform discussion.
Yeah. It's basically lifting the renewals and how much renewal work we're doing. There's a lot of compliance.
I guess my question is, it's more of a priority now, but it wasn't 3 years ago.
No.
Why?
The drinking water standards have increased.
Okay, so it's driven around standards.
Yeah, and there is those standards include, you know, number of outages that are acceptable. You can't have water outages for any length of time without being reported. Yeah, so the regulatory framework's tightened right up.
Yeah, no, I get that. So I think for our understanding, I think we want to know what I think we want a good visual over all three models.
Yeah.
Yes, present us the middle model, but actually what's the blue sky and why, and what's the sweat the asset model, so we can understand the thinking around the three, if you like. And we don't, and conscious of the information or the work to provide that information. But you know the sorts of questions we ask, so we should do by now. So yeah, I'll go to you, Alan.
Yeah, it's a bit of a continuum where you want to land, you know, and we'll give you all the different scenarios. And,
I guess it probably should be driven by a requirement to the new authority, what standards we need to attain, and we base that, and so we try and reach those standards, but over a period of time. I'm sure they're going to give us a period of time to achieve that. It might be 10 years, for instance.
I think it's important to note too that we're not just talking about water supply here, drinking water, we're talking about wastewater. And, you know, Tamara are just embarking on that now. And so there's going to be a whole suite of new standards, new requirements come through for wastewater. And likewise, stormwater is the other one that's a bit of an unknown at the moment. So it's in, you know, with the new consents that we're having to go for, there could be a lot of increased costs there.
And my understanding is they haven't really touched on stormwater yet. It's still in the too hard basket. So they're working hard in wastewater and stormwater. That might be another 5 or 6 years away. We don't know. What's really important is that part of your support for the C4LD principle about keeping it was they talked about a proposal of having a national entity similar to Waka Kotahi that you could apply for funding. That becomes so much more critical to help you achieve what you want to for your community without passing on all the costs to them directly. So the lobbying and advocacy for that type of funding mechanism from central government will become much more critical and a key role, particularly for the Canterbury Mayoral Forum. So I'll move on to, if the Three Waters stays with TGC, this is the impact on your debt, remains at 205. Your debt headroom at 280% goes down to 145. And if you retain your debt cap in your policy, the headroom goes down to 57 million. And it's important to note that your 25 million revenue that you currently get will stay. Your current levels of expenditure on CapEx is 26 million, but there's another 14 million on OpEx. So it roughly costs about 40 million on this financial year. So when we're looking at revenue and expenditure, you are investing in water currently. And you're doing that to help meet standards, help to repair some of the old infrastructure that's met the end of its life, and protecting your community's future.
Increase resilience.
And increasing the resilience, which is protecting your community's future.
Andrew, am I right, generally speaking, out taking stormwater, 6 years ago when I came into local government, we were talking about stormwater and what was on the horizon, and nothing's happened since then. And so I agree, it's probably going to be another 5 or 6 years. And we've got money in the later years for stormwater improvements too, haven't we? I'm not sure if we know what to do with them, but am I right in thinking that the next 10 years is, because of the work that we've done on Parrera Pipeline, take out Claremont, we've done some of the other plants, it's going to be focused on small main renewal, is that correct?
Yeah, I have to say that, it's our water asset is going to be in a really good space in the future. We've spent a lot of money on that area. It is going to be very robust, and, it's really good. So the next step we'll be looking at the wastewater, and that's potentially some very large costs coming through there, and later that the stormwater. So,
When do we
revolving program.
discuss the, I see you've put there, the first thing you've written is 280%, and then you put our self-imposed debt cap. So, that doesn't move that self-imposed debt cap unless we have an agreement around this table, is that correct? That's right. Yeah, good.
So those parameters that Jason showed earlier are ones that we'll be considering, but we're always going to be at the point where we'd have to be considering that debt cap for this, and 3 years ago we knew that, yes.
You can actually choose to make your debt cap the same as the LGFA one, or you can tighten it. It is a fluid, completely dependent on your desires and the goals you set for yourselves. And that will be part of the discussion on the 10th of October when the policies come to you, because it's in one of those policies that debt cap is actually set. Okay.
Just on stormwater, some years ago, and I can't remember, I think it might have been 2018, long-term plan, we started to increase the investment in stormwater, and our stormwater management plans do signal a significantly enhanced level of service. And you see that when consents come up or there's subdivisions or something like that, there's an expectation of a higher standard around attenuation and what goes into the receiving environment. So while it might be some time, that stormwater investment is starting now, but it might be some time before the full effect of it is felt through the revenue expenditure and the balance sheet lines. But there's no doubt that for a long time, I think it was seen as the poor relation, and that is of the three waters, and that is changing.
I think we can agree a lot of that is changing because we're having more heavy rain events, and it's becoming a higher feature. So, and we're working on the resilience to that, sir. Okay.
And all this leads to a big headache. So Nigel there looks like he's got a bit of a headache. Councillors do, and I think staff probably do as well. We've got a lot of financial challenges. If we look at the reforms uncertainty of water and RMA, we've got the effective timing of water, whether it's in or out.
That's not your avatar, sir.
I'm not going to comment on that. And we've got the ongoing inflation, labour market constraints, interest rates, they're all carrying on. Our projected rates are too high. When we did the 23-24 annual plan, of course, at the same time we plan out the 10 years. So rates are double digits if we don't do something. Our proposed capital program needs to be deliverable, that's fine, but also needs to be affordable. Last year, we delivered 55. I think the plan was in the 80s, and that was partly due to some timing differences with the theatre in Egantai. But we need to make sure it's deliverable and affordable. So we really do have some challenges, which we'll talk about on the next slides in terms of how we're hoping to resolve some of them.
The infrastructure challenges. I've highlighted that there will be some high needs for some major CapEx investment, especially when we move into that wastewater space, and in future when we move into the stormwater space. There is still a question mark around the uncertainty and timing around affordable waters legislation and the future of that. Your CapEx costs keep rising for a variety of factors. And when we defer CapEx and think, okay, well, we can sweat out the assets a little longer, it does have a consequential effect on increasing your OPEX. And an example of that, like with Peel Forest, we have done mitigation effects, sometimes $500,000 a year to protect that until we had the means to work on the big CapEx costs, which is to move that. So every time you defer a project, there will be a subsequent cost. I've talked about the roading and footpaths funding shortfalls with the current levels of service. Your roading team does punch above its weight. I really do commend them for what it is that they do. I know that there is grievance around unsealed roads. That's in every district, I can assure you. And they become a particular issue, especially during the dry season, and then you have a rain and more potholes appear. So your complaints do go up. There is a cycle of that. We also have more closed landfills that we know we will need to address as we go through the work program assessing them. And at the moment, there's no current source of external funding through the Ministry for the Environment, but I know the Mayor and the Canterbury Mayoral Forum are working on various campaigns to lobby central government with waiving waste levy fees, setting up a specialized fund for closed landfills, and we're also looking at how we can expedite the resource consent procedure around those so that we can actually look to taking action necessarily without the unintended consequences of having an extended resource consent process. So,
I'm sure the meeting's interested in that.
yeah, well, there are every council around the country, and we have the added benefit that the mayor has had direct conversations with ministers around this, and the Canterbury Mayoral Forum have already written to the Minister of the Environment, and he's looking favorably on some of the suggestions that have been put forward. So, and the rest of the country is looking to us to see how that goes. And they'll all get behind and support, but very few of them are the ones front-footing it.
So we have a number of levers and options that we really need to be looking at, and I think there's about 6, which I just want to talk through today. First one is really around OPEX, around priority OPEX. And look, I'd put a challenge out firstly to SLT and then to Council through that we need to look really hard at our BAU in terms of what we do, how we deliver it, and what can we do differently. So as I mentioned, staff are at the moment working through creating the budgets, and so SLT will go through and rigorously critique those. And then Council, when you receive your activity management plan, same thing. Very easy to add things in, but we need to really look at what we can hold, what we can reduce. We need to look at decreasing expenditure. We need some suppression. We need some cost control in certain areas. We need to ensure that our fees and charges are actually recovering our costs that they're meant to be recovering. OPEX is a big part of our business, 128 million of revenue, 122 million of expenditure. If we can suppress some of that, if we can focus it, then that will certainly help out. Next slide is around prioritising CapEx. Look, we've got the Theatre Royal and Heritage Hub decision coming up, as Councillor Scott mentioned before. Again, that's an interesting decision. We've already sunk a lot of money into it in terms of the 11.6 million from MB and additional funding. So it's very difficult to change an approved council project, and it really needs to be more than just a minor cost increase. It needs to be some significant some changes, but again, that'll come back to council for decision. But capital is much more than that. Do we sweat our assets further? Not really productive sometimes. Councillor Booth before, some of them do last longer, but we really need to make sure that our capital program is fit for purpose. Are we assessing the condition correctly? We've got a bit of economic growth going on. We really need to focus on that as well. What's nice to have? Can we do everything? These are the questions that councillors are going to have to ask on the way through. Do we defer increased rating for renewals now, but then we're just pushing more costs onto future residents? We've talked about prudence, we've talked about fairness, we've talked about equity. Is there a trade-off given our current investment in long-lived assets? We really need to be considering some of those areas. We've got options around recycling capital, increased surplus land sales. So we have some surplus land from time to time. Do we keep it in-house? Do we use that for savings? Do we offset some of our other challenges that we're facing at the moment? We really do need to review levels of service and understand what our trade-offs are. And look, I can't reiterate this enough. And I've been around local government enough to know that it's very hard for councils to reduce their levels of service. But we really need to review. Even if we're keeping it at the status quo, we need to understand what the implications are on that. We've got significant cost escalation. We need to think, is this what the community needs? We need to hear from the community. Is this what they want? So we really do need to understand all the trade-offs. One option is to introduce new revenue streams. Always a bit of a challenge, as the Mayor's referred to. A lot of them do need government action, government intervention. The way that local government's working at the moment, is it really the right fit for the right outcome we're trying to achieve? We need to look at development contributions at some stage. It's a source of revenue which most councils have that stream. We don't at this point in time. So we really do need to focus on some of these new revenues. And I think finally, we can increase rates beyond a normal level. We went out 11.1 as part of the annual plan. That was really high. And that was even a constrained number in terms of what the organisation probably needed. We're already at peak rates. That's already unpopular. And I guess my last point is it may be less visible if affordable waters kicks in. Because, of course, we might have water charges. So there might be an entity charging our community through that. And so our rates might be less, so it's less visible, but it's still an impact on the community. So I guess I'm challenging the organisation with BEAD and the SLT. I'm challenging councillors that we really do need to, we can't carry on with what we're doing. So we need to ask some hard questions and we need to be very challenging. And to Councillor Piddington's points, you need the evidence, you need the data, you need the scenario planning in order to make some decent decisions. Because the financial strategy is your decision. We will implement it, we'll make it work, but really councillors need to implement the financial strategy as your guiding document.
I see you put a question mark after already at peak rates, and that's a good discussion, and I think we need to bring some analysis in. Our ratepayers would tell us we are, but you know, picking up from the last taxpayer survey, which takes us through to first of or end of financial middle of 22, is looking at the other provincial councils, so providing like services. There's 2 councils out of the 23 that didn't provide the data, but we were third lowest. And so I think as part of this, it would be interesting to just do some comparisons somehow. I know it's not easy, but as an example, Waitaki have higher rates, but they're not providing, waste services. So how do we get some of that analysis and tell the story to our ratepayers around the value that they are actually getting for the rates?
Yeah, and look, that's a fantastic point. And look, I've worked in a few councils where they do provide some of that comparison information because, look, arguably this council is wearing some of the decisions from many, many years ago council where there were 0 rates, there was 1-2%, which were outstanding at the time. But our base is so low that if we do an 11.1% increase, which council did, it takes us up a bit, but it's still, our base is still very low compared to similar type councils. And so when you're putting them up at 10%, there's a headline number. Yeah, it's loud and it hurts. But our base and our community have almost been, it's artificially low, but it's very hard for a current council to fix overnight.
And the challenge, sorry, I'll let you go. And the challenge with that is telling our story, isn't it? So how do we have those direct comms with the community? Because the challenge is relying on, and it's not right or wrong, but we can't be reliant on, the Herald as an example to tell our story, because that's never going to get printed that we've got low rates. So
that comes to the engagement strategy. That's when we have you front and center telling that story to the community. And we will be coming to you with a few ideas about how it is that you're going to interact with the public, because we will make sure you have everything you need. But the message really needs to come from you, all of you, to your constituents, to let them know Timaru's in pretty good shape. They get a lot for their rates. It's just not always recognized. And let's be fair, in every provincial community, a council's a very easy news piece. And your rates is always a very popular thing to discuss in the media. When you get to the bigger towns, it's usually either the council or the hospital board. I think what's really important is we control the narrative. So we go out there with the good stories. We go out there saying we've delivered a much higher level of service in roads and in our water and in some of our community services. You know, you have really high-class facilities, particularly things like your library and the art gallery and what you're proposing to do for your theater. And it's about the community feeling that they get value for their rates. And that's the part where you have a lot more to contribute to fill out that part of the story, because that doesn't tend to make those media headlines. So when you're out there talking to the community, we will make sure you have the right material to present to them, and it's about you delivering it. And we'll get you out there in the right places, at the right venues, and right events where the people are. Rather than making the people come to you at a community hall, we will go to where the people are.
I guess just thinking about the Three Waters and the impact that it would have had on the price of water, if it's obviously gone through, but if it were to proceed, you can be assured that the water prices or to our ratepayers would actually more than double. And if that model that has been used and what they want to do, they will be having to operate with some form of profit in there, as well as paying for a whole lot of people that are doing nothing. We are delivering at cost. And I know that we are not charging enough, in my mind, certainly for our commercial users, for water usage. And so there are opportunities. What if it actually those water charges, I'm sure they would double.
Well, that leads me on to the next set of slides, because Jason's talked about the high-level principles of things you can do, and I'm actually now going to introduce some specific actions that you can actually take to address some of the issues that we have actually raised this morning. The first thing, we need to look after what we've already got, and we need to deliver what we say we're going to deliver. That's what the community expects from you as a council. So we need to scale the size of our capital program. We're talking about the prioritization of funding, and we may need to look at some process changes. We may need to do some Section 17As to actually look at how we can best deliver some of these services in the most cost-efficient manner. I know it's been a tension point with when we contract out so much. Is there some viability of setting up with other councils to establish some CCOs that actually will do the works on behalf of all of the councils, like a roading team that goes around fixing the potholes instead of contracting out to external? There's a whole range of options you can look at for there. And we need to make sure we're budgeting for the whole of life OPEX for the assets in all our projects. Jason's talked about divestment of surplus and underutilized land and facilities, and ensuring that we are charging reasonable lease fees for land that we are leasing to some groups. But we do have quite a bit of council surplus land that we could be looking at how best can we use that and make it work in our favor, even if it means putting some of facilities that we know that we need in the future. Can we use our own council land to put those facilities on as opposed to buying more? You know, just thinking about things a little bit differently. Okay. Talking about our infrastructure, that's where your resilient line comes in. Very seriously, we have to take a serious look at climate change. You have had the climate change strategy for the whole of the district. We need to look at what we can take out of it and make useful for our council. And this is the LTP to help do that with some tangible actions that we can do. So we want to look at the impacts of climate change, which all of the activities that are doing an activity management plan are addressing that in their activity management plan and also with the natural hazards. But we want to look at what we could do as an organization as well. Like, should we be looking at our procurement? Should we be looking at our fleet? Should we be looking at a range of options about reducing emissions? And it's about getting some baseline data first. So we need to look at, if we're serious about wanting to address emissions, when we're looking at investments, do we have a green lens on that? We need to be working more with the climate impacted communities. Being a braided rivers communities, you do have some very vulnerable areas, and do that engagement across the district. Increase our knowledge, data, and understanding of the climate risk, and look at some targeted emission reduction projects that we can initiate in-house for our own activities. We have a role to be a leader and an advocate on how to reduce emissions in the Timaru business community. I don't think it's not something that the community wants for council just to tell everybody else what to do. I think they want to see the council walking the talk as well and leading the way. And I think some of those things in the climate change strategy can be taken and made into something meaningful that you can put into action to meet that purpose. And that means actually probably doing a few pilot projects. So remember at the start when I'm talking about your priorities are not determined by your vision, they're determined by your budget. So it will be what you put the funding towards. Okay, now planning and investing for a growing and changing demand. As stated before, the growth may not be at this current point in time, driven by population, but we're investing for a time when it will be, because we do have economic growth and we have changing demands because of that economic growth. Our roads are taking a real hammering because of the extra transport and the trucks and the industrial growth in this area. So that creates some service level challenges for you. One of the things that you have mentioned, particularly in our last workshop when we went over some of the assumptions, when we were talking about planning and growth, and what I heard was, I think the council is talking about an integrated planning model where we have infrastructure, district planning, and some of the services looking at the data of where the growth projections are going to be throughout the district and which communities, and do the integrated planning between all of the different facilities here and services to do a growth strategy and take into account all the work that has been done in the district planning space. They have commissioned a lot of really good reports. How do we actually bring those together into a plan for you guys to be able to plan for the future that you were talking about in the last workshop? We can't do all of this on our own. So collaborating with central government, developers, Mana Whenua, and the communities to identify those opportunities and make the most of it is really critical. Partnership is one of the key words we really need to make this LTP about. We don't have a lot of spare change to do a lot of shiny new with our commitments of what we have to do. So we need to really leverage partnerships and relationships. We need to look at how we promote more active travel, public transport usage, road safety, all of those things that can make a real difference in a livable city that's not always so car-centric, to help reduce your emissions and also increase the livability. Foot traffic generates more profit for your shops, front and center, okay? And let's look at some alternative funding options and models. Thinking outside the square. Making sure we have really good, robust data. Now, having worked so closely with Susie and Roding, I know the improvements that have been made for the data collation are really impressive. You have got a very good sense of the evidence needed to support every business case that they send to Waka Kotahi. Waka Kotahi, of course, are measuring that up against, 68 other territorial authorities plus the regional ones. But the data that will be presented to you for anything going forward is robust and sound. So that is an example of using it to inform your projects. Trying to identify and maximize some external funding opportunities, especially for the new technologies. Let's be honest, the public sector will never be on the cutting edge of technology. You just don't have the funding for it, but capitalize in partnership with things like Callahan Innovation. Look at how you can actually capitalize on the work that they're doing. Lincoln University with their food tech and things like that. How can we partner with those kind of progressive institutions on the cutting edge to bring the benefit back into some of your council projects? And looking at the social and cultural data, like what is important to Mana Whenua? How do we know that any urban planning that we do, what the impact will be on any sites of historical significance? Does it encompass all of the cultures? We have an increasing diversity in this community. How will that be reflected in our future planning? Okay? And now, there you go. This is the framework, and here are the key questions you have to ask yourself. That will be Boothie. Well, I didn't put stop the madness, but I did put, and what is affordable? Because that is a key question, and what is deliverable? Readjusting your halo, sir. So, yeah, but those are the really key questions that will come up time and again. And what we're asking you is we want you to have the robust discussion amongst yourselves. And right now at the timing, it's a good time to stop here and have a cup of tea. And then come back and start having those discussions with some of those questions so that we can help prepare for the next workshop. Okay. Thank you. So we're going to break for a cup of tea, and I'd say 15, 20 minutes, maybe? Yep, 20 past. We can come back in here. Thank you, councillors, for your time this morning. Thank you to the SLT, especially Andrew, for coming up and supporting. Thank you. And thank you, Jason. sorry, after the last workshop where we were looking at assumptions, and I asked for any feedback, Councillor Pye sent me some really good feedback, and I've had one or two pieces from some other people. So I'm going to send you out a revised set of assumptions. They are not, there's no big critical changes, but there are some tweaks and some rephrasing of things. And we have the new Burrell figures now for the financial assumptions. So at the next workshop on the 10th of October, we will go through those with you. Okay? The other thing was we talked about what you think the big issues are, which will be leading into this discussion we're about to have. And I have put up a word salad that had a whole bunch of things. I am going to send out again through the poll everywhere. I'll send you an email that will allow you to vote for the things you think are the big issues in the community, and also allow you to provide some narrative if you have some comments you want to make, and we'll go over those on the 10th of October as well. Okay, so now we just want to hand it over to you. I trust that the mayor and Councillor Booth would like to lead a lot of this discussion around affordability and immediate versus future needs. What are the trade-offs that you want to do? And so I'll hand the floor over to you.
Thanks. I've just got a couple of follow-up probably questions from the last slides. One was around development contributions. So we've talked about that for a long time. We don't have a policy. Is that on the cards, or can we move that forward? We've had, you know, development contributions versus financial contributions, to the point where we're considering or having discussions last week on variation to district plan, etc., and the costs involved for council, largely unbudgeted again. Should we be changing and considering a DP? So development contributions policy, Andrew, should we be moving on that today rather than yesterday?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. There are pros and cons with development contributions. Firstly, yes, you can get quite a bit of money coming in from developers, but then there is the flip side is that council is committed to installing the infrastructure for those developments. So if the risk is if you get an Alka sequence development, so one that's at the top of the catchment, for instance, council is required to install the infrastructure all the way up to that, to service that piece of land, and then have to wait for the development contributions to come in at the later date. So that means that you will need to have some borrowing capacity in the meantime until that land is developed. One of the advantages, though, of development contributions is you can actually start charging, I guess, a contribution towards community type infrastructure. So there's an option there to charge towards parks or reserves, aquatic centres, stadiums, those sorts of things. And also you can charge, I guess, a component or growth component of headworks, so treatment plants in particular. Yeah, so yeah, financial contributions is very much a user pay system. So those who using that infrastructure pay for that infrastructure, whereas development contributions are more of an overall, all developers pay on an equal basis or semi-equal basis.
So if we can tie that to our conversation that sits with environmental services and the district planning, would it be advantageous to have one over another, potentially with what's ahead of us, if we were, hypothetically, to want to encourage more growth in residential, green space, greenfields development?
Well, your Greensfield development is where you're going to get your most development contributions, income coming in. But there is a bit of a hybrid option, which is what we're using, for instance, on Brough Scully, where we have a financial contributions policy, but it's set among the whole subdivision as such. yeah, where you've got multiple landowners, it's quite difficult to get financial contributions from one particular landowner. You know, they don't like paying the infrastructure going across a neighbour's property, for instance. So, but with Rough Scully, we've managed to, you know, come up with a formula that allows everybody to fairly pay in their contribution. Now we could do that for other land areas where we're proposing to doing development area plans for along the Pages Road area, the Elton Gardens, Callans Hill areas. Yeah.
So that's a great one, actually. So with the DAPS and development contributions, how would that fund? Because currently we have to fund the DAPS, but if we had development contribution policy, would that help fund?
Yeah, we're paying for the DAPS, and you're right, there will be a financial contributions policy developed as part of those DAPS.
Because my challenge at the moment is where it feels like we're heading is we're going to end up funding developers, and the ratepayer is going to be subsidising the development, and whether that's right or wrong, that's up for discussion through a proper process. But if we're properly considering all income streams, which Jason's highlighted, you know, we probably should, then this is probably one that we should be front-footing now, because we want it to be a part of the LTP. So if we don't do it now, then we know we're considering it.
An example of that is Washtike, where a policy is chosen to fund the upgrading of the existing infrastructure to cope to basically cater for those developments. It's another option. Yeah.
I'd hate to get to March and we need to have a conversation about this.
Yeah, I agree. Because if you're going to do a development contribution policy, you need to do it through your LTP. Yeah.
Right.
But we also do need to have that growth information. So to get that done for this next LTP may be a bit of a push, because we're having to invest a lot of money in doing these development area plans to have the information to calculate.
If we put our solution-focused hats on, how do we get to a point where we've considered it for the LTP?
I think also the issue of development contributions, there was some apprehension about how hard you'd push it if you were going to lose your three waters, because it did contribute to some extent, and we already had our FC, so there was generally, I think, from previous councils, Paul, not a lot of appetite necessarily for DCs.
Previous council had a leg in each camp.
Yeah. Yeah, a leg in each camp. And then if you overlaid that with the uncertainty around whether water was going, if you go back 2 or 3 years, whether water was going to be in or out, it became a bit of an area where you could be investing a lot of time and money in a policy that might then have to be significantly changed again. Yeah. And we have FCs, which we are maybe not quite as broad, but we do collect and we've used to recover in terms of the infrastructure going into various developments. So if we are going to look at it, it will require some investment in resource, and we probably want a pretty clear steer that that's what we want to do in order to get it going.
The other thing with FC is it tends to push brownfields development, infill housing, which is because we're looking at getting our efficiencies from. Yeah, that's the focus of the council. Previously is to look at infill, and that's what the focus of the district plan is.
Can you have a hybrid model whereby, or is it, can you have a hybrid model, development contributions on greenfields versus infill?
Well, that's what the DAPs are really going to achieve, where we...
My question is who pays for the DAPs? Yeah. What I'm trying to get it back to is a point where it's funded by the developer, they wear the cost. That's probably a discussion for council, but if they're the one that profit, so development contributions are more in line with that than a financial contribution. Is that correct or not?
No, with development contributions, you can only charge those for the growth component of the infrastructure. So the actual preparation doing the DAPs and everything else would still be a council cost. You wouldn't be able to recover that from developers in the future through development contributions or even financial contributions.
Right.
So we are, if we're going to take the lead on facilitating growth and development, we need to do the DAPs and pay for those, which is what is the intent of the proposed district plan.
I didn't really get an answer. Should we be considering development contributions policy before the LTP as part of it? What do elected members think? Any views?
Well, the developer should be paying for everything that's required for them to connect to our services. And they should probably, if there's a amortised amount that perhaps should be added to the rates for the section, or I'm not sure how it works, but perhaps for a period of time, I'm not sure, or just a bulk amount per section.
Andrew, that we have that sort of model at the moment, that hybrid model, it exists at the moment. So that's how it's done, rather than over one landowner, it's done over the subdivision. I think that's what I understood. That's what the hybrid model does now.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that is correct. Yes. And then whether you're using development contributions or financial contributions, the developer is still responsible for putting the infrastructure into service within the site. It is the development contributions and financial contributions pick up, I guess, the costs of having sufficient capacity infrastructure to take that land use development. So.
The difference between the Washtite one, that I presume, sorry, I don't actually know whereabouts, but that would already exist. New renewals. That example you gave before?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah.
Basically, a lot of the roads, for instance, weren't wide enough, didn't have curb and channel, so council is funding that as part of the contribution. Where Bruffs Gully, there's a lot of land that needs to be taken for roading, and that cost is distributed across all the land.
Mayor Nigel, should you be considering one? I think rather than just try and give a yes or no now, why don't we try and provide a reasonably high level document about actually, here are the FCs, here are the DCs, here's the hybrid model, and here's what's required in respect of each, and present that back. I think might be an easier way for us to address it, because there's probably a few things we just as officers want to tease through and put into a report,
No,
and then say, look, broadly.
That can even be a 1 hour workshop or something initially. Probably
Yeah,
makes sense. And
but
so,
some modelling.
and my question, how does that, you've modelled Bruffs Gullies on financial contribution. Be interesting to know that scenario, what that would do if it changed to DCs.
Correct,
Yeah.
Because I can see that being an issue if we've modelled it on one and then we change to another potentially. I'm not sure.
It could change it.
It could,
yes. It tends to average out things instead of whereas FCs is very much a user pays. Yeah.
That's
Yeah,
right. We'll go with
on the development, isn't it?
Yeah, on the development,
On the
yeah.
development, it's user pays rather than.
Okay, no, well that would be helpful, and then that gives us time to feed in. So that would be in a November. We can November maybe.
Yeah.
I think we
could do that.
I think we can do that. Yeah, I think we can look at that.
What does, as far as Vincian?
Through the chair, you can request that report to develop a development contributions policy. And that's what you're actually talking about, because there's a lot of engagement with developers and things, because it's a significant change for them. We would put it out with the LTP for consultation.
No, to fully get that. But as far as bringing us more information,
Oh,
Yeah.
more information
Yeah,
easily.
yeah, no, that's fine to line with LTP.
Yeah, we're sort of thinking the first cut is some sort of model that says, look, here's what
Yeah.
FC's, DC's, the hybrid model, and some, I guess, some broad level modelling about the kind of numbers, I think, is that we produce, so you get an idea about what it is that in terms of revenue,
Yeah.
what does it generate,
Yeah.
as I understand it.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. No, that's good. Thank you. And so that's my first question. My other question is, you know, and take, you know, what is deliverable? Well done, Gavin. I love that too. Great look. What should we be doing around our current facets of council that need a 17A review across them? So when have we completely reviewed, you know, if you look, and I'm not saying these are what they need, but these would be obvious examples where you've got 26.13 million and 26.12 million in roading and Three Waters services. Yeah, so under the Local Government Act, I think it's within a 6-year period, effectively, isn't it? We've got to review its levels of service. Sorry, Vince, you might part. Yeah, great, thanks. So I've got to.
Yeah, I might be able to answer. Basically, the Section 17A reviews, you're right, it's every 6 years, or when a major contract is due to be renewed. So the roading and Three Waters have recently been done within the last 3 years because of their contracts requirements. So yeah, comprehensive reviews were done.
What the legislation states is you're looking for the most cost-effective and efficient delivery of the services. And so it outlines CCOs, in-house delivery, contracting out, or hybrids. So what's supposed to happen is you come back with a report to council to say what the costs of all of those things and the recommendations.
As we saw the 17A review on Three Waters as an example, which was added for the second meeting. And although I agree with the approach that we took, now we're almost in the next phase around consideration for the next 3 years. So can we have those 17A reviews just put on the hub for our information, the roading and the Three Waters, and then also what, and they were just easy because they're big numbers, but you know, I know I've talked with Trudy, and I'll highlight to you, Bede, around social housing, and that's an obvious one to look at. Partway there through parks, yep, we're partway through. So what other 17A reviews should we do to line up? And bearing in mind that we're taking a deep dive look at costs this LTP, so is there anything else that we're missing that we should be looking at?
I would suggest that maybe what you could ask is for a report from SLT that they actually come up with a list of recommendations as to what potential activities could merit a Section 17A review with a look at efficiencies, improved efficiencies, because there could be some things that may be better outsourced to, like, say, another council who may have more resources available for that, or it could be that responsive type of service, if that works. I know Christchurch City has just recently instated we group that goes around in direct responses, but it's proven to be very popular to the complainants. So, you know, and that's just a little mobile group, response group that goes out and patches up what they need to, rather than outsourcing that through the process of a contractor. So that's a tangible example of what another council's done. But I would recommend that you just ask for a review from the SLT after the AMPs to make recommendations for council to come up with a schedule.
So the conversation that we're supposed to items that we're, isn't it?
Is about some of the principles and issues, and it is a discussion amongst your anything, but it is talking about what are some of the trade priorities. Are there some nice to haves, and mechanism that you can look at on how to reduce some of the rating impacts. So it's those type of things that we're inviting you to engage in. And it's not a conversation only for today. Today is the beginning of the conversation because you're going to revisit this all throughout this process.
Yeah, for me, it's thoughts around the financial strategy in terms of debt levels, capital depreciation rates, some of those items as well, to help give direction, I guess, to the organisation to move forward.
Well, it's for me, it's about financial prudence and obviously living within our means. I think as the long-term, lots of things have changed, and we probably had to compete with obviously interest rates trebling from where the last ones were. Also, the CPI has. So there's all these natural things that are actually driving those numbers up. We've only got a certain amount of money, and therefore we probably need to cut our cloth, in my opinion. So most of these projects have gone up extraordinary, and obviously the theatres one in hand. We started at 29 million. Probably started lower than that. Here we are, we're now at 57 million. And, you know, for instance, just on that item, $1 million based on the 57 million, because we've already got 7 million, they paid us 4 point something. So, and the interest every week just %. So every week, that theatre is costing that amount of money. So I'm not sure what you think you're going to charge for a show. It to be a hell of a lot. So and that's without paying it off. And that here we are, we're talking about 80 years, and I do not see 80 years as being a number that should be used in the equation. 50 years as outlined in the IRD. So I think that's the starting point. I think it's the water, the three waters, the roading, and then obviously well, number 4 is probably our civic facilities, I guess. So those are the things that we should almost work out how much money and work our budget out from there, and then let's look at those projects. Stadium. I guess the Argentine is underway. There's a big another 50 million added and a continuing liability. That is a major issue.
Top that, Boothie. I guess operating cost is. You know, we make these decisions in splendid isolation. You know, I can tell you the Ashburton Council puts 400k a year into. We've never really discussed that. there'll be some discussion that we've put a person in somewhere in the budget. But before we make solid decisions, been missing, and also concerned coming. You know, that could be $60 million. Well, we need to be aware of that when we points out the bucket of money is going to be empty, and we need to make Michelle just showed me before, 3 years ago we were going to review all our facilities, council-owned facilities, whether they had value or not. We haven't. And to your point, Jason, we need to do that, whether they're being used, whether there's a better way of doing it. And my other thing, I guess I do get concerned, and it ends up being big money, cost tens if not hundreds of thousands of dollars, and then we change our mind. Is there a better way of delivering that? Or are we sure it operates? That's some of the conversations, because, you know, we want it to be a great figure rates and saying to people, hey, but we're doing good things. I take Nigel's point, we need to sell where we sit compared with others. We're delivering. And I'm not sure we do that well. So, telling the story. But I also think we need to make lost in some ways what the council are doing. We give you a budget and on it goes, but we don't actually find out year to year what that is and whether actually it's essential or it's a nice to do. You know, if I take your Three Waters, Andrew, you've doubled from 3 years ago what you need just to get by. I want to see what that is, because there might be decisions we go, no, or that can be over a longer period. I'm with Alan though, I don't think any building can be over 80 years. We've got to be real with our funding, because over that 80 years, we will redo the interior 3 times at multi-million-dollar costs. So let's get real about the numbers. You know, that's where I want to be.
Yeah, and that's interesting. And whether you do it over 50 or 80 years, at least there is some depreciated funding in there to do that refit. And that's the key thing, is that the depreciation sits in there in a realistic manner to be able to do that work.
I guess that's not to mention the amount of money they need to collect from the ratepayer for the depreciation over and above the number I just gave you.
Yeah, but if you look at our total asset book, if it were our total assets, if we were depreciating them all, which we're not, but if you look at that $1.7 billion worth of value, and you get to a point where actually renewals are fully depreciated, then, you know, what does that look like? And actually that's the trajectory that we want to get to, that we are allowing more in depreciation to fund those renewals when they come up, rather than having to approach it a different way.
But then the 100% of depreciation should actually be being spent on infrastructure and replacements. Well, it's actually, some of it's being siphoned off and actually capitalised into staff costs.
Associated with the renewal.
With different projects that are on the go. It's been a constant number in our reports every 3 months.
But to that specific asset class, which is what we do. I'm not sure what the issue is.
Councillor Booth, the depreciation fund is spent on renewals or replacements, is it, Andrew? Yes. And that is capitalised. So that's what the depreciation fund is used for, that. And we are, as I said before, we are essentially consuming that full depreciation every year. In fact, we could up the amount of depreciation if we were fully funding it, as Jason said at the beginning. The question is, how much do we want to? But it is all getting spent on capital. I don't think there's any of it not going to capital, and in fact, I think the auditors probably, that I know that they check the OPEX versus CAPEX spend quite carefully when they do the annual report every year. It's quite it's a big part of the Q&A between the auditors and officers.
Yeah, you know, there are some councils, and I'll give an example, Waimakariri or Selwyn, where they have a lot of new assets. So their depreciation, I know with Waimak in particular, they're not spending their full depreciation. So there is quite a significant reserve, and I think from memory, Waimak has about 20 million sitting in the bank at the moment, but we're not in that situation. Our assets are, as I said before, towards the end of their useful life, and we're having to actually fully fund the renewal program.
And their average rates are a lot higher than ours as well, because they've been through having to reinvest post-earthquake, so, yeah.
Yes.
I think you've got to be careful using phrases. Great one for the quote book, but, you know, siphoning off without putting some substance around where you're siphoning funds off to.
The numbers are simply capitalised as going towards projects, and that's what I mean. They take so it's our staff, they capitalise the number against the project. So, anyway, I'm just looking at the debt, and the last long-term plan we were maxing out at 200 million, and now it's 280 million. So we're only 3 years down the line, and that's increased by 25%. So, and our income has increased as well, obviously, but still, what's going to happen in the next 3 years? Are we going to be having a similar conversation? So I just think at some point you've actually got to pull your head in, actually, and not spend so much money, and actually have something up your sleeve. We do not want to go to maximum debt, and I'd be quite disappointed if that's where we headed, because we won't leave the next generation or next group of councillors any space to do anything. At some point they will have to stop spending and live within their means, and we should actually be starting to think about that right now, and set a number and actually live within those numbers, and we do that by prioritising what the requirements are in order to continue the services, but obviously some of these capital spends on infrastructure and whatever, we need to actually carefully consider the appropriate order and the prudent way to go forward to ensure we're not overcommitting ourselves in case we end up paying a whole lot more interest potentially. Who knows where that's going to go? But it's probably, you know, who knows? But the problem is we are here now and we are responsible, and I would be quite concerned if we left and burdened our next triennial or the triennial after that with nowhere to go.
I think the other thing that you've got to consider is actually we've got to a point for whatever reason, because repairs and maintenance wasn't spent on the library, and the way I analyse this is, and this is actually probably credit to engineers. The engineers over the last 20 years have been great at getting money in the budget, and they've been running the horizontal infrastructure, and then you've had the vertical infrastructure sitting on accountants, and so they're pretty quick to remove repairs and maintenance and all those sort of things. So you've got an accountant laughing in the background, a couple of them. So you've got to a point where actually our investment needed is in vertical build, and you've got a moment in time which is catch up, and that's the moment in time that we're in this 6-9 years either side of us, whatever, that you've got to get that back up to date. So actually, yes, future councils won't necessarily be able to do a lot because a lot of that vertical infrastructure has been replaced, and then at that point your debt ceiling is going to be going back down like this. And so that's what, to your point around the questions that you're asking, is part of this process, and the asset management plans and considerations, debt ceiling, all those things, and it's just the part of the LTP process that we're going through.
I guess just on the looking forward, I'd like to get all the genies out of the bottle, like Andrew again said about roading. I want to know from the council officers what else is in front of us in the next 10 years, be it roads, bridges, that we know is coming up. So when we make our decisions, we make them fully knowing what else is in front of us, because that has been a missing piece a wee bit.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah, so no, I agree. An example for me probably would have been the last, going back 3 years, what I deem should have probably been in a pre-election report was the sea down water scheme. That was actually missing, and it was $17 million roughly of investment that we didn't know until the new council came on board. But being a council in the previous council, I didn't know that. So to Stu's point, I think we just need to know every little detail.
Perhaps I'll just say something about the our three waters and our it's obviously our biggest number that we actually are investing in, but I think that should be driven by a requirement to reach the standard that the new authority have implemented upon us. So it's not like we want to go here when we only actually have to go here at this stage. And I think so. That's one way we could actually simply peel things back a little bit and actually work towards. We may have 3 years. I don't know what you'll be more informed than me, but a certain amount of time before we have to meet that achievement. And so therefore that is the focus and probably the priority number one for me, and then perhaps roads and then civic facilities after that.
Sorry, question. As far as water schemes though, once we get the Waitoa pipeline fixed, we're actually fully compliant as far as water schemes, aren't we?
Apart from Sea Down. And then there is also Beautiful Valley, but that's a very small scheme. It's only 10 users, but
It's actually technically a stock water scheme. It's a stock water scheme, technically.
it's a stock water scheme.
Yes, so
but there
if
is,
it remains a stock water scheme, it's fine.
it's a decision that council needs to make at some point, is confirm what it is. Is it a stock water scheme or is it a drinking water scheme? I would suggest it's a stock water scheme. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm going to have a couple of words. I thought I was being entertained by both of you for too much of that. Yeah, I actually personally think that although this is a challenging time for us, it actually presents some really exciting opportunities. And looking forward to hearing the EMPs and looking at different ways of doing things and delivering results. And I know Mayor Nige started the conversation when I first came on board about having a look at the things that perhaps can be brought in-house, and we talked about the potholes and all of that sort of thing. And one of the things that COVID created for us is that it is the challenge for some of our contractors. They delivered a different level of service in many different respects, and we saw how much of that was tolerated by our communities and how much isn't tolerated. So we're going to have to think about those things differently. So how we deliver various services and out of our OPEX, not just our CAPEX, because I think it's easy to look at some of these capital projects and say we're going to save $10 million there. And I think not necessarily. So we're going to have to change in some respects the way we look at BAU. And that to me is an opportunity. And like I say, looking forward to hearing the AMPs and getting stuck in from that respect.
Probably have a different view to Councillor Booth. I think the civic, like the roading and the water is important. I always think that, but the civic stuff is also important because that's what brings people to our district. Roads and water do not bring people to our district, and so I think that stuff has to be done. And we can't have a town without a theatre, without a stadium, and without an art gallery. They're kind of like the core things that towns have. I'm not adverse to lifting the debt cap so long as there's a plan to bring it back down, and so long as it is a hump and there's not 3 or 4 other humps straight after it. I also think we need to look at the social housing and the housing, and rather than prioritise projects and say we're going to do these 6 and not those 2, I'd rather go how can we do all 8 within that financial package and still deliver them. They just won't be gold standard because we can't afford that. That's probably all I have.
I agree too, but I suppose that challenge, going right back to the start, that Jason, you said the 30-year infrastructure strategy, and we only do a 10-year financial strategy, and it's about balancing that. That's sort of triggered me today, but, you know, I think you're right too, Councillor Pye. I think, you know, we can still deliver. We've just got to work out how to do it and be solution-based, you know, and I feel, you know, just reflecting and looking back on how the council has operated over the various years, you've got to start making decisions, and I feel that sort of stopped for a while. You know, if you look at the theatre, it should never have gone that long on making a decision, and so we've got an opportunity now to actually start delivering on some of these projects. It's got to be affordable, and I get that, but you've actually just got to start getting stuff done, because otherwise we'll be still sitting here and my grandkids and your grandkids won't even have a theatre. So, you know, but I know we've got to balance that, but we actually need to start making some decisions instead of going round and round in circles. So, yeah, I look forward to the next session.
Oh, sorry. No, look, just a comment. We did, you know, if I go back 2 years on, you know, financial strategy, we did think that we would have to be, just for background, that we would likely be considering debt caps at this point. So it's where we expect it to be to some extent. So, yeah, for those new ones.
I agree, Mayor Bowen. We did expect to be up the top of our debt cap a couple of years ago. For me, it's about resiliency, and that's the most important. And we will do that with our water, with our microfiltration, which was in the last long-term plan, and with our roading. But I also agree with the projects. We need to be delivering on them. We've consulted with the public. The public have had their chance. They've directed us as governors. We've listened to them. We've put into plan, and now we need to deliver. So it's about following through and closing that circle. So that's where I stand.
Yeah, I guess from a rural side of it, I think that probably the rural people are more dedicated to thinking that council should go back to its core businesses of water and roading and stuff like that. So, yeah, if it's affordable, those nice to haves are great to have, but, you know, we need to be within our means. I don't know that we can afford to put our ratepayers through a double-digit rate increase again year on year. I think that's just too much to handle for a lot of people, and the way the financial headwinds are. So I think it's just, yeah, figuring out what our needs are, what our priorities are, what our wants are, and then putting them into a queue. And obviously with what Andrew's said today, there's some headwinds that we can't see, and roading and stuff. So, you know, we need to still make sure that our rural people are connected to the city and things like that. So I think that's where I'd like to be heading for this long term.
This is the first long-term plan I've been involved in, so I agree with what people are saying, bits of what people are saying. I know when I'm doing my own budget at home, I'm trying to do the best to live within my means that I possibly can. And the whole time that I've been in council for this past nearly year, it just seems to be that we are relying so much on debt, and I'm not used to those sort of figures that are being bandied around. But I'm also aware of the fact that, as Councillor Pye was saying, yep, the roads and the water, it's all vital stuff. But you're right, people don't come to this district for that. Although, of course, they do come for good water, and that's an important thing. But they do come for all those civic facilities that we offer. And I just can't imagine being in a city or a town this size and not having a theatre, when we have one in Oamaru and we have one in Ashburton. And, you know, I've been quoted on the radio as saying, well, we've got a show coming here. If you're in Ashburton or Oamaru, you can go to it. But unfortunately, in Timaru, you can't, because we haven't got a theatre and haven't had for the last 4 years. So that has to change. And we do need these sorts of civic things to to make our town or our city a great place to live. But what I want to see from this long-term plan is some sort of plan to pay back some of the debt. It just seems so incredibly high, and we don't seem to be really focused on bringing that debt level down. So I want to see more of that.
So you can't, so to give you some perspective, you can't have a theatre and bring your debt level down. You can't. So, and we'll map this out over the next few workshops and what have you. And so you will get to a point and you'll be coming down to the future. But when we're recovering, none of us may be around the table when we're back to 100 million of debt. That's just the reality of what it is. And just to give you some perspective on councils as an infrastructure provider, if you look at the water entities, they were looking to borrow up to, I think, 6 times revenue. So 6 times their revenue versus our up to 2.8. So there is actually a lot of capacity within the system of infrastructure providers. The same within, it'll be interesting with DPP4, what the ability for those entities within the electricity infrastructure providers to fund around their asset renewal. So I know it's hard one to get your head around sometimes because they're big numbers, but as far as actually providing these sorts of, especially the utility type of infrastructure where we've currently got $100 million worth of debt, and I've always actually looked at it and thought a proper model actually should be within council, should be your utility, your horizontal type infrastructure and your vertical build over here. So potentially you've got a debt cap on your vertical build that might be a 1.5, but actually your utility type water infrastructure might have a higher 3.5 as an example, and your average might be what it is, but it means actually you're maintaining the asset according to a specific ratio. But I'm sure that will never come into fruition, but you heard it here in Timaru today if it does ever.
Through the chair, you can do that if you want to in your own strategy.
Yeah, just one point I will make out is, when we prepare these long-term plans, and you as a council, between a rock and a hard place in some ways, you do it 10 years, and that's based on the standards, and the goalposts are there. But then the government moves the goalposts, and this is happening through that 10-year period. And this is the situation where we've got with waters and roading all the time, is that unfunded mandates from central government increase costs. And that, at the time when we set this long-term plan, we were unaware of that.
Andrew, based on that, and this is speaking to your experience, you've been around a couple of decades now, as far as a serious question, as far as the water standards, how many times in that period would you have seen them change to a point where it's actually reflective on what you need to up your spend on? Is that consistent? Because you look at what's happening now and you wonder, well, actually, can the water standards change again? I would question they probably can't go too much higher once you get to that point, unless there's some specific, health study around nitrate in water or that's proliferant in our catchments as such. And then you might have we might have to meet a standard on something that's not already there. But I sort of question, is it going to go any further? I'd say probably not.
It is a hard one to answer because you need a crystal ball to do it. But yeah, it tends to go in steps, and usually it's through some sort of crisis or something that it pushes that increase in standard. And the Havelock North one was the catalyst for the last lot, which has increased costs for water supply right across the country immensely. Yeah.
And you're going to have more of probably a more pragmatic view come in if there's a change of government too, because you've got costs wastewater discharge to land versus discharge to water as an example. You're throwing hundreds of millions of dollars more infrastructure where you're discharging to land. It actually isn't achievable. It shouldn't even be a consideration really, should it? So you wonder if some of those standards may actually change because when the costs is brought into it, it's just not affordable for a country as indebted as New Zealand is.
Yeah, and I think to your point, Bowen, if you do look back and you take water as an example over the last, 5 to 10 years, not only have you seen this really appreciable increase in the cost of replacing the assets, but in terms of maintaining and operating the network, all of the usual drivers around energy, chemicals, etc., they all go up. But in terms of those standards going up, if we look at the qualification and competency requirements of the teams that operate our water treatment plants, that service our networks and so on, all of them have jumped significantly in order to make sure that you meet the requirements of your water safety plans. And they do drive right across the board quite significant increases into the operating costs. So it's not just in the depreciation, it's really the requirements around the training, the skills, the ongoing training, the testing, all of that. And when you run it across schemes all having to come up, then it is an appreciable increase on top of any drivers that might come as a result of just the usual sort of cost inflation or CPI cost increases.
Yeah, we have to, basically monitoring is a huge cost these days. We have to continuously monitor. If we don't monitor it for 1 minute, we have to report.
Yeah.
It's just those sorts of requirements, so that it increases the whole technical competency required of operators because they're operating using this equipment now.
And of our IT infrastructure and so on, so that it's all licensed, it's all maintained at a standard that enables that monitoring full on. I think what's been really helpful here is that the two documents that I think will be really important are the financial strategy and the infrastructure strategy, because they give you that long-term view into where you're going, and you do see the debt levels, for instance, you do see the assessed conditions as we understand it of our water networks, our wastewater, our roading, but they give you that horizon as best we have it from that 10 to 30 year period. So I think they become really important, and we'll emphasise those documents and the component parts of them as we come forward. I think that would be, I think give not answers but visibility into the way you might want to shape and frame some of the issues about those long-term matters. And if we're really honest, water is a very big part of our business and a big part of our economic enablers. And in a sort of a notional sense, irrespective, I think we'll have a lot more clarity on October the 15th about the direction of it. And that will help considerably. We can make all the assumptions, but it'll be good to be able to just wipe it and say, yeah, this is the way we know now with full confidence that we're heading, whatever that outcome might be.
I think it should be noted that, infrastructure does actually bring people to this district because, look at our growth, it's all economic growth. So you need good roads, you need good water systems, you need good wastewater systems, and that is what's attracting our growth at the moment. So
I think the point being, they won't come from infrastructure alone. They'll want to, because if they have disposable income, they'll want the point being made that with disposable income you want to do something. So you need sports fields, you need cultural facilities, recreational facilities, the sea bays, the parks, the reserves, the art galleries, the museums and theatres and so on for people for that span of activities. Yeah. It's not as I suppose. Yeah. Pardon? Well, yeah, he does, and it's great to have the engineers. Because as I've often said, really, when you look at if you look at a number of areas around the country and you talk about the Wellington model in more ways than one, our networks generally perform pretty well in an area that, when it doesn't perform, man alive, people know in a heartbeat when water's not performed, when your water doesn't work. We all know, and we know immediately. And the networks do generally, touch wood, suit for anywhere I can find it, generally pretty well performing.
Right, I think that brings us to a natural conclusion about the importance of the financial strategy and the infrastructure strategy. I'm glad that that's the note we're ending on. That was our intent and purpose for today's workshop. So I thank you all, councillors, for participating. I thank the senior leadership team for their support and for being able to provide some clarity. We have a few notes from today of some things that you have asked for, and I will be sending you out some follow-up material, as I said, the assumptions and, the priorities list for, what you think the big issues are for the district. We will see you again, of course, on the 10th of October for our next workshop. And in the meantime, we will be beavering away in the background, producing the goods for you so that you have something to discuss. Thank you, councillors. Haere mai. Have a great day. And can I please have the reference group stay behind? Thank you. We conclude.